Hello fellow sapiens, a quiet welcome from Midnight Sapien. Whether you're unwinding at home, driving through a late night, or tucking yourself under a stack of blankets, this space is for you. Because tonight we are tracing how Ice Age families built shelters to survive deadly blizzards. This is slow science and calm storytelling for curious minds. An untold architecture waits in the bones and hides of the past, a practice that is 20,000 years old and answers to the white silence. But this is not merely a manual of tools, it is the story of how shelter became a defiant act of community and courage. Oh, and if you are someone who loves long-form, science-based calm stories, consider tapping like and subscribe. It helps this kind of thoughtful storytelling reach other wandering minds who seek quiet wonder. By the way, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Share it in the comments so we remember we are listening together. Also, you have permission to fall asleep if you need to, and timestamps in the description will guide you through the chapters. Now, we begin with a single wall, a bone-framed hut holding a small fire against the storm. To survive a deadly blizzard in the Ice Age was not merely to avoid death, but to outwit the atmosphere itself. It was to understand cold not as an absence, but as a presence, vast, howling, alive. Against this endless adversary, families did not merely huddle behind rocks or beneath trees, they built, and what they built was not crude. It was deliberate, ingenious, and quietly defiant. They stretched hides across mammoth ribs, they stacked bones into walls, they sealed the wind out with fists of moss and earth. In the white silence of a world trying to erase them, they etched out shelter. They made architecture in the abyss. But what was this white silence really? What is a blizzard when there are no roads, no buildings, no news alerts? When the world is flat and infinite and the line between horizon and sky dissolves in a blur of snow? The storms of the Upper Paleolithic were not passing inconveniences. They were events of geological weight. Walls of cold moving with the force of nations. Winds that stripped skin from flesh. Air so dry and brittle it could crack open lungs. The Ice Age was not simply cold, it was structured around cold, ruled by it. Cold was the architect, and every living thing answered to its blueprint. How do you resist a force that has no face? How do you oppose something that cannot be seen, only felt? A pain that wraps itself around every surface, every thought. This is what the blizzard was. Not just falling snow, but the grinding scream of an atmosphere turned hostile. And yet, humans stayed. They stayed when even the mammoths turned and wandered south. They stayed when the steppe became a killing field of frost. They stayed, and they began to build. Not with pride, not with ceremony, but with a quiet urgency that made survival possible. There is no written record of the first hut, no blueprint scrawled on hide. But there are bones, bones that lie in rings, bones that once stood vertical, leaning into each other like strangers pressed together for warmth. Archaeologists kneeling in frost-bitten soil near the Dnieper River have uncovered the remains of what might be the oldest known shelters made by human hands. Circles of mammoth bones arranged too precisely to be random, too deliberate to decay. Each one tells a story not of glory, but of necessity. A story whispered in marrow and sinew, protect the fire, shield the child, block the wind. And what must it have sounded like, that wind? Not the whistle of a winter breeze, but a deep predatory roar. A sound that did not just come and go, but encamped for weeks, moaning over the plain like a siege engine. You could not wait it out. You could not walk away. You had to meet it with structure, with foresight, with form. You had to imagine a shape that the wind could not collapse. And then, with bone and hide, finger and flame, you had to will that shape into being. And so began one of humanity's quietest revolutions. Not of weapons or fire, but of walls. What does it mean to draw a line between inside and outside, between storm and sanctuary? What compels a creature to imagine space as something to be divided, defended, enclosed? Long before cities, long before temples or towers, there was this, a frame of bone wrapped in the skin of the dead, a circle of safety in a landscape designed to erase warmth. It was not shelter from rain, nor shade from sun. It was resistance to obliteration. The storm did not care that children lay shivering in their mother's arms. It did not relent for age or hunger or grief. And yet, amid this merciless cold, life continued. Bundled in furs, crouched beside flickering hearths, Ice Age families clung to each other and to the dim promise of morning. What does a blizzard feel like when there are no walls yet? When the only barrier is your back pressed to the side of a mammoth carcass, or your breath warming the inside of your hands as frost crystals spread across your eyelashes? The exposure was total. The elements did not merely buffet skin, they soaked into bone. And that vulnerability, that raw intimacy with the storm, carved ingenuity into the marrow of our species. Because something remarkable happens when death is no longer an abstract fear, but a wind pressing into your ribs. You begin to imagine differently. You begin to listen, not to the gods or the spirits, but to the land itself. Where does the wind break? Where does the snow drift? Where might the mammoths walk next, leaving behind a frame to borrow? The first architects were not artists. They were foragers of pattern, scavengers of structure hidden in death. The scale of these storms must be understood not in modern metaphor, but in prehistoric gravity. The Ice Age was not a single season. It was an age sculpted by ice sheets a mile thick, by glaciers grinding entire continents beneath them. Storms brewed over the tundra like thoughts in a dreaming mind, slow, immense, implacable. Some may have lasted not hours but days, their fronts stretching hundreds of miles across, their winds coiling like serpents through river valleys. This was not the weather. This was the world, a climate not in flux but in rain, and in that rain, every human choice carried the weight of survival. Step outside at the wrong hour and the storm could claim you. Fail to secure the wall of your shelter properly, and the wind might peel it open like a fruit. But from this terror emerged precision, the angle at which a rib was planted, the tension in the stretched hide, the gathering of snow along the base not as an obstacle but as insulation. They learned by watching what the wind destroyed. They learned by burying the ones who froze in their sleep. And they built, again and again and again. Not out of hope, but out of memory. Each shelter was a whispered equation between flesh and frost, a living experiment in how long the body could endure. Picture the scene, a plain of snow stretched to the horizon, sky and ground indistinguishable except for the dark smear of mammoth herds moving like slow tides. A cluster of humans kneels in that whiteness, their hands red with cold, their breath drifting upward like smoke. They have no blueprints, no written law, only the handed-down gestures of survival, how to prop one tusk against another, how to weight a hide with stones so the wind will not lift it, how to arrange bones into a circle strong enough to anchor a dream of morning. This was not just construction. It was choreography, a ritual of bodies moving together in the blinding glare of snow. Children fetched small bones, women stitched hides with sinew, men drove posts into frozen earth. But these divisions were fluid. Survival does not honour hierarchies. Everyone built, everyone contributed to the fragile illusion of permanence, and in that labour was the first spark of something beyond necessity. Community as architecture, memory as a wall against oblivion. Was it here, in this work, that humanity first began to imagine home, not as a location, but as a collective act of making? The violence of the storms gave their efforts a kind of sacred urgency. The blizzard was not just a threat, it was a sculptor, shaping the very way humans thought about space, warmth, and safety. Each gust taught them what would fail. Each drift revealed where snow could be made to serve, packing the base of a wall for insulation, sealing cracks where heat might escape. In this way, the blizzard became a teacher, harsh, indifferent, but instructive. Could it be that without such relentless cold, the ingenuity of shelter would never have been born at all? Archaeological evidence suggests these shelters were not haphazard heaps of scavenged remains, but intricate constructions, some measuring more than 20 feet across, with internal hearths and separate areas for sleeping and working. Imagine stepping inside, the muted glow of firelight, the low ceiling of stretched hide, the scent of smoke mingled with animal fat. Outside, the storm claws at the world. Inside, a fragile pocket of warmth holds human voices, human stories, human breath. This contrast, the ferocity without, the hush within, is the essence of the Ice Age shelter. And yet even this sanctuary was not impregnable. At times the wind would find its way through seams, snow would creep inside, or a roof would sag under its weight. Repairs were constant, vigilance was survival, but every patch, every reinforcement was also a refinement, an iteration in the unending experiment of living against the storm. Over generations, these refinements accumulated like sediment, forming not only stronger shelters but stronger minds capable of imagining walls before they existed, of seeing space as a thing that could be shaped, held, protected. This capacity to shape emptiness into refuge was humanity's quiet inheritance from the white silence. It was born not in comfort, but in extremity, in the unrelenting pressure of a world that demanded adaptation or extinction. How else can one explain the patience required to stack bone upon bone in freezing winds, or to stitch hides with sinew when fingers were cracked and bleeding? Such patience is not natural, it is learned through necessity. It is the patience of species-level memory, of lives lived on the edge of annihilation. And yet, from this emerged something soft and astonishing. The first sparks of foresight, the first inklings of design as an act of care. Think of the small gestures inside these bone circles. A child's toy carved from antler, a row of stones arranged around the hearth to keep embers from scattering, a niche cut into the floor to store fat or tools. These were not merely survival tactics, they were signs of minds reaching beyond the moment, shaping not just space but time, planning for a future hour of hunger or a future night of cold. In these gestures, the shelter was no longer only a wall against the wind, it was a cradle for thought. Could it be that in making a home, however temporary, humans first began to imagine permanence, a continuity stretching further than the next hunt or the next storm? Outside, the blizzard moved like a living entity, a predator whose form could never be fully seen. Inside, firelight flickered against bone walls, and smoke drifted through vents carved in the roof. The contrast was profound, not just sensory but existential. Here, within the circle, one could speak without shouting against the wind. Here, one could dream. This small interior world became the first classroom, the first theatre, the first parliament of voices, and always, at its centre, the fire, fragile as a heartbeat, but radiant enough to anchor an entire community's sense of being. The ingenuity required to create these shelters was not only material, but social. To gather enough bones for a single structure meant scavenging the remains of dozens of mammoths. Such a feat demanded planning, cooperation, and knowledge of animal migrations. It required trust, a collective understanding that survival was shared. The blizzard did not merely test their walls, it tested their bonds. Only together could they drag ribs across miles of frozen ground. Only together could they lift hides heavy with frost. Only together could they create a space where life could continue. In this way, the storm's violence was the hammer that forged the community. And yet, even as these shelters multiplied across the steppe, they remained ephemeral, built to be dismantled, rebuilt, adapted to new seasons and new herds. Permanence was still a dream, not a reality. The families inside knew this. They slept with their boots near the fire, ready to move if the wind shifted or the mammoths vanished. But even in impermanence there was a lesson, that survival was not a fixed state but a practice, an art continually refined against the endless white. Was it this practice, this rhythm of building, dismantling, learning and rebuilding, that taught humans how to live with change rather than fight it? Because the white silence could not be conquered. It could not be reasoned with or repelled. It could only be endured, and in that endurance a strange kind of wisdom took root, a way of seeing the world not as an enemy, but as a partner in a grim and necessary dialogue. The blizzard howled and the bones answered. The snow fell and the hides stretched tighter. The wind swept across the plains, and in its wake it left not devastation alone but instruction, written in the patterns of drift, the groan of tusks, the tilt of shadows. What must it have meant to be alive in such a place, where every sound was a warning, every breath a negotiation? Even now, when we walk through cities of steel and glass, warmed by machines and cut off from the seasons, something of that ancient silence lingers in us. We insulate our homes, seal our windows, press our hands to radiators in winter, not just for comfort, but in echo. We still build against the cold. we still seek the place where wind cannot follow. And perhaps this is why the story of the Ice Age shelter resonates, because it is not only a record of what once was, but a mirror of what still is, a reminder that the walls around us are more than architecture, they are ancestry. When we study these shelters, when we kneel beside the bones embedded in frozen soil, brush away the centuries, reconstruct the curve of a dwelling from a scatter of ribs, we are not just performing archaeology. We are reaching back through time to touch the moment when humans first said, with structure and flame, we will stay. We will not flee every storm. We will not vanish into the snow. We will endure here, together, in this circle we have made. How fragile that decision must have felt, and yet how immense its consequences. Because everything begins with shelter. Before language had grammar, before myth had shape, before trade or agriculture or civilization itself, there was this: the need to keep the cold out, to keep the fire lit, to keep the children safe. In answering that need, Ice Age families began to create not just structures but systems of cooperation, of memory, of adaptation. They began to build meaning into matter. A hide becomes a roof, a bone becomes a wall, a circle becomes a home, and in that transformation the human story begins. So the next time snow falls against your window and the wind rises in the trees, pause, listen. Imagine a wide and endless plain, a fire flickering in a dome of mammoth-bone, a family pressing close in the half-light of survival. Imagine what it took to outlast the storm. Imagine how much we owe to those who first did. And ask yourself, in the stillness between gusts, what shape will I build against the wind? What circle will I draw to hold my warmth, my kin, my story? In the white silence that never truly left. The fire was never enough. Not on its own. It could warm the hands but not the air, cast light but not protection. Against the vast white cold of the Ice Age, a flame was a beginning, a symbol, a promise, but never the solution. You could sit beside it and still feel the wind's fingers threading through your hair. You could sleep near it and still wake covered in frost. The blizzard, with all its weight and roar, did not fear fire. It slipped around it, under it, through it. The flame was a flicker of defiance, yes, but alone it could not shield the body from the sky. Still it was sacred. In the earliest caves of Europe, fire appears again and again, buried deep within the dark, not at the mouths of shelters, but in their interiors, in places where no sunlight ever reached. Archaeologists uncover these ancient hearths, like fossils of resolve, blackened stone circles nestled among ochre-painted walls, char layered into the soil from 1,000 nights of smoke. Some are as old as 400,000 years. Some show signs of deliberate maintenance, of wood arranged with care, of ashes cleaned and swept. Fire, even in the deepest dark, was tended like a garden. But what does it mean to plant light in a cave? It means survival, yes, but more than that, it means meaning. To build a fire is to draw a line in time, to mark the moment when heat becomes something summoned, not stumbled upon. And yet, as crucial as it was, fire had limits. It could not stop a gale. It could not block a drift. The families who huddled around it learned this with a kind of slow dread, night after night. They saw their breath freezing in the air just inches from the flame. They watched sparks rise into nothingness as the storm pressed in from every direction. What happens when your only warmth is exposed? When your last resource glows, but glows too vulnerably? In time, this awareness must have begun to change the way humans thought about the flame itself. Not as a fixed point, but as a centre needing protection, a heart that required a body. Fire was not the shelter. It was what shelters were built to protect. And from this realization, everything changed. Suddenly, the cave became more than a refuge from predators. It became a partner to the flame. Its stone walls held the heat, amplified it, cradled it. In open plains where caves were rare, the need became urgent. If no hollow in the earth existed to hold the fire, then one would have to be built. Was this the moment when architecture began? Not with ambition, but with a shiver. Because a fire on snow is both a miracle and a contradiction. It survives by being surrounded by its opposite. The colder the air, the brighter it burns. But what if the snow turns to water beneath it? What if the wind lifts the sparks and scatters them? Flame alone, as early humans must have discovered, could not be trusted without form, without frame, without skin, without shelter. So the flame taught them not only warmth but structure. It demanded walls. It demanded invention. It asked a question the storm never could. What will you build around me? In that question burned the next great human leap. Not technological, but conceptual. The idea that a flame could be surrounded, tamed, held within something crafted rather than merely found. The idea that fire was not the end of survival, but its centre. From this centre, space unfolded. Around the fire, circles formed, of stone, of bone, of people. Patterns began to emerge. No longer did families scatter loosely across the steppe, following warmth wherever it happened to appear. Now they created it, and where they created it, they stayed. Fire, for all its vulnerability, brought gravity. It gave weight to a place, and as fire gave weight, it also revealed limitation. A flame exposed to the open air loses more heat than it gives. Without walls, its warmth dissolves into the sky. Without a roof, it invites the wind to play its cruel games. A fire in a cave can raise the temperature by several degrees, enough to mean the difference between frozen breath and sleeping breath. But a fire on the plain, surrounded by nothing but snow and stars, that is a flame that burns fast and dies faster. Early humans knew this not as theory but as ache. They carried the smell of burned hair and wet ash. They learned by loss. We know this because of the hearths, scattered across layers of loess and ash in the open air, where evidence suggests fires were repeatedly built in the same location. Why return to the same place unless it offered something? A break in the wind, a natural fold in the land, a cluster of stones that remembered warmth. These open-air hearths tell of a longing not just for heat, but for habit. They are the marks of a people learning not just to survive the cold, but to outthink it. But even so, without enclosure, even the best hearth was a flickering gamble. A fire could be drowned by a storm in minutes. A gust of snow could kill it as surely as hunger. So came the dawning realization. Fire needed allies. Walls, roofs, entrances positioned not just for access, but for insulation. And once that idea entered the mind, it spread. The hearth was no longer a simple blaze. It became an anchor. Around it rose ribs, bones, branches, hides. These were not passive shelters. They were built with fire in mind. Vents to draw out smoke, stones to radiate heat, door flaps to trap warmth within. The shelter and the flame became interdependent. One could not fulfill its purpose without the other. What happens then, when a people stop seeing fire as a tool and start seeing it as kin? Because fire, once seen this way, begins to shape behaviour. You feed it, you protect it, you return to it again and again. In the dark you measure time by its glow. In the cold you judge space by its reach. In the wind you test your walls by how well they hold the heat. And from this intimacy grows attention. Suddenly the material of a wall matters. The way a roof slopes matters. The texture of a hide, the weight of a mammoth-bone, the direction of prevailing wind, all of it becomes data in the unspoken equation. How do we hold the fire? How do we hold ourselves? Because that is what the hearth began to reveal. That warmth was not simply a matter of combustion, but of cohesion. It was not just the fire that needed protection. It was the people drawn to it, bound by it, shaped by its centre. When flames rose from those early hearths, they did more than melt snow or cook meat. They pulled bodies inward. They created a centre of gravity around which language could form, memory could pass, silence could settle. The fire made space for thought, for stillness, for the sharing of warmth, not just in temperature but in story. Archaeological traces of this gathering are subtle, but profound. In sites like Terra Amata in France or Gesher Benot Yaakov in the Levant, researchers have found burned plant remains, scorched bones, flint tools blackened by proximity to the hearth. These are not the signs of a passing spark. They speak of sustained presence, of groups returning to the same place season after season, rebuilding the fire, remembering its lessons. And around these ancient hearths, something else is often found: spatial order. Stones placed deliberately, debris swept aside, patterns in the soot. These are not merely messes left by survival. They are the first blueprints of intention. Yet still, the vulnerability of fire lingered. It could be extinguished by a sudden squall, buried beneath falling snow, stolen by rain. And so humans began to surround it, not just with hides stretched between sticks, but with structure. Not just enclosures, but environments. Fire transformed from an outdoor phenomenon to an indoor necessity. And in doing so, it forced a revolution in how space was imagined. Before fire, shelter may have been occasional, a cave found in passing, a hollow tree used in crisis. But now shelter had to be planned, built, maintained, because without it, the fire would die, and without the fire, everything else would follow. Was this the moment we began to tether ourselves to place? Not just following animals or weather, but choosing to stay, to remain beside the hearth we had built, the structure we had raised, the warmth we had protected. The fire required maintenance, it demanded loyalty, and in exchange, it offered stability. Could it be that the earliest human settlements, the first glimmers of domestic life, did not begin with agriculture or architecture, but with flame? Even the physics of fire encouraged this shift. Heat rises. Without a low ceiling to trap it, warmth escapes. Without walls to reflect it, energy is lost. Early humans began to understand these principles not through theory, but through the ache of cold shoulders beside a high flame, through the success of a tighter hide stretched close to the ground, through the way breath misted differently in well-formed spaces. Over time, the fire taught them engineering. It shaped their designs by rewarding certain forms with comfort and punishing others with cold. In this way, the blizzard became the test, but the fire became the tutor. What deeper knowledge arises when warmth itself begins to shape your thoughts? It is knowledge born from the body before it ever reaches the mind. The sensation of heat radiating off stones, the way smoke curls and seeks an exit, the subtle shift of air when a flap is drawn tight. These are not abstractions. They are tactile lessons, learned by cracked hands and frostbitten cheeks, passed from elder to child in the language of gesture. Over time, these lessons coalesced into patterns. Stones ringed a hearth, not randomly, but with intent. Openings in walls aligned with the direction of prevailing wind. Hides were layered in ways that minimized drafts. The hearth was no longer simply a fire. It was a system, embedded in space and in memory. In some sites, archaeologists have found evidence of multiple hearths within a single large shelter, their charred circles spaced in ways suggesting different tasks, one for cooking, another for warmth, another perhaps for toolmaking or ritual. Such complexity speaks to minds already thinking in terms of zones, functions and flows, the same mental frameworks that would one day give rise to rooms, houses and cities. And always at the centre was fire, the beating heart around which space organised itself, like muscle and bone forming around a pulse. Yet the limits of fire remained stark. It could dry hides but also crack them. It could warm air but also consume oxygen. Too much smoke could choke a dwelling. Too much flame could ignite a roof. In learning to house the fire, humans were also learning restraint, how to vent a shelter without losing heat, how to bank embers to last the night without sparking a blaze. This balancing act, played out across generations, seeded a deeper discipline, an understanding that survival was not a single invention, but a relationship. You did not simply have fire. You lived with it, negotiated with it, designed your world around its moods. And this relationship was transformative. Families who once huddled in open plains began to favour caves not only for their protection from predators, but for their ability to hold warmth. Those who lived where caves were scarce began to build shelters specifically to nurture fire. Roofs became lower, entrances became angled, surfaces became reflective. All of these changes were subtle, but together they marked a pivot in human existence. From adapting ourselves to the landscape, to adapting the landscape to ourselves. Fire was the hinge. Imagine then an Ice Age evening, wind clawing at the step, snow rolling in heavy waves. Inside a low, darkened shelter, a fire crackles in its stone ring. Shadows of ribs or branches arc across the ceiling. Children press their hands toward the glow, their eyes catching the reflected light. Adults adjust the hides, bank the coals, clear the vent hole. In the flicker of the flame, knowledge moves, not in words but in actions repeated until they become second nature. And in that repetition, the idea of home deepens, becoming more than a place to endure the storm. It becomes a place to remember, to plan, to dream. What might emerge from such a space but culture itself? Because culture does not begin with painting or poetry or myth. It begins with repetition. With a need so persistent it becomes tradition, and with a space so familiar it becomes sacred. The fire, cradled in its ring of stone or bone, becomes the first altar, not to gods, but to survival. Around it, the day is divided, food is cooked, tools are shaped, wounds are tended. Its light stretches time into the night, allowing thoughts to unfold beyond the day's labour. The moment fire found its shelter, something in the human story changed. For the first time, warmth did not depend on weather. It depended on will, and that will expanded. When we examine the archaeological record, sites like Dolní Věstonice, with their patterned hearths and scorched clay figurines, we see evidence not only of utility but of expression. Fire was used to harden, to preserve, to transform. Clay met flame and became durable. Bone met flame and became tool. Thought met flame and became gesture, art, permanence. In this crucible of necessity, invention became inevitable. But invention was never separate from the structure that held it. Without shelter, the fire could not teach. Without fire, the shelter could not live. And so a bond was born, a threefold covenant between flame, form, and family. From this triad, all future dwelling would descend. Every hut, every hearth, every house and hall and high-rise owes its ancestry to this ancient alignment. The fire in the snow, once a lonely flicker on a wind-blasted plain, became the seed of civilization. And that seed required shelter to root. It demanded that humans begin to think not just in terms of survival, but of design. What holds heat? What traps smoke? What shape contains the most warmth for the least material? These are not idle questions. They are architectural principles, encoded first in instinct, then in trial, and eventually in memory. Memory, after all, is the true structure. It is what allowed a child watching their mother adjust a stone to remember that placement years later when building a hearth of their own. It is what allowed small changes, the angle of a wall, the layering of moss, to become inherited wisdom. Fire revealed the need for structure, but memory carried that knowledge forward. And each time a new shelter rose around a hearth, the knowledge deepened. This was how tradition formed, not from dogma, but from firelight flickering across faces in thoughtful silence. So what does it mean, truly, to say that fire was not enough? It means that warmth alone could not preserve life. Only the structure around it could do that. It means that comfort in the end is not given by the flame but by what surrounds it. And perhaps it means something more, that even in our brightest discoveries, we are incomplete until we build a place for them to endure. The fire changed us, but it was the act of sheltering the fire that made us human. And what will you shelter in your own brief season of cold? What fragile warmth will you shape space to protect? The shelter that stands in defiance of a blizzard must be more than shelter. It must be a fortress stitched to the edge of extinction, and yet in the heart of the Ice Age. That fortress was not built from stone or timber. It was built from the bodies of giants. Imagine it. A ring of tusks, some longer than a man is tall, leaning inward like ribs of a colossal lung. Vertebrae the size of helmets, locked into place as if forming the spine of a great animal that now sleeps beneath the snow. Jawbones, scapulars, fragments of skull, all arranged with care, with deliberation, into circles, ovals, spirals. The walls of the dwelling are bones. The ceiling is stretched to hide, and inside firelight flickers across the silent remains of the mammoth. What does it mean to build your home from the dead? At sites along the middle, Dnieper River in present-day Ukraine, archaeologists have unearthed structures that push the boundary of what Ice Age ingenuity could look like. These are not caves. They are not temporary lean-tos or windbreaks. They are complex constructions made from the skeletal remains of woolly mammoths, not one or two but dozens. Some shelters use more than 400 bones, and these bones are not scattered or haphazard. They are placed, interlocked, repeated. A pattern emerges. a rhythm of survival set to the beat of extinction. These are not tombs, they are not shrines, they are homes. But the paradox is haunting. To live, humans had to take. To be warm, they had to strip a creature of its warmth. The mammoth, with its thick hide and insulating fat, was not only meat, it was material, and its bones, once buried beneath muscle and time, became beams, frames, architecture. These were not ornamental trophies, they were load-bearing grief. What must it have felt like to sleep in a structure built from the bones of something that once thundered across the plains? Something whose eyes you may have met before it fell. The construction of these bone huts, some dating back 20,000 years, shows more than improvisation. It shows adaptation, innovation. The ribs were used as arches, the skulls as anchors, the hides as roofing. In some, stones were placed atop bones for added weight against the wind. In others, mammoth tusks were planted vertically to form doorways, gateways between frost and fire. These were not the dwellings of people barely scraping by. These were the dwellings of people who understood the landscape as a system, who read the environment like a map, and who saw in death the possibility of continued life. And still, the wind came. Even with such walls, the cold roared through the cracks. Snow gathered where it always found weakness. Repairs were constant. Reinforcement was a ritual. Yet every return to the dwelling, every reassembly of the circle, deepened the knowledge. The structure became a memory held in bone, a shape learned not from blueprints but from blood, from breath, from watching a mammoth fall and thinking, we will carry this weight differently, not as a carcass, but as shelter, not as waste, but as structure. What does it mean to live inside the echo of something gone? The wind did not ask such questions, but perhaps the bones did. Laid in deliberate circles across the frozen earth, their hollow forms once filled with marrow now served as pillars of warmth, memory, and necessity. The very curvature of a rib, the broad surface of a scapula, these were repurposed by human hands into the architecture of survival. The people who built with them were not engineers in the modern sense, but their choices were no less precise. The size of the circle determined how much heat would be lost. The placement of a tusk could shift how snow accumulated around the dwelling. Form was function, and function was fate. Along the Dnieper, these circular bone dwellings emerged like whispers in the archaeological record. Not in hundreds, but in just enough numbers to suggest knowledge shared, remembered, passed on. At sites like Mezhyrich and Mezin, skeletal structures reveal careful planning. Some bones were not local, they had been carried, dragged, transported over distances too great for mere convenience. Why carry a mammoth jaw across miles of frozen steppe? Because the builders understood its strength, its shape, its place in the puzzle of survival. These were not just shelters, they were expressions of insight born in cold and practiced over generations. Some dwellings were dug partially into the ground, their bones forming the walls above shallow pits, allowing the fire's heat to rise and linger longer. Others show signs of multiple rooms, partitioned with ribs or shoulder blades, suggesting different spaces for sleeping, working, storing food. Within these spaces, archaeologists have found tools, beads, even fragments of ivory carvings. Evidence that inside these gravebone walls, people did more than wait out storms. They crafted, they spoke, they remembered. The mammoth bone huts were not merely functional, they were cultural, but culture comes at a cost, and the cost was staggering. A single hut could require the remains of over 100 individual mammoths. Some of these were hunted, others scavenged, but all of them were transformed, from creature to material, from presence to absence shaped into purpose. The act of building with bone forces a reckoning. How many lives must be unmade so that one life may persist? Did the families who lived inside these structures feel the weight of that exchange? Did they trace their fingers along the smooth arc of a tusk and wonder who the animal had once been? In the modern world, we speak of sustainability, of balance, of limits. But for Ice Age humans, those concepts were not abstract. They were tactile. If the herds moved on, if the bones became scarce, if the shelters failed, they died. There was no buffer, no surplus. Each structure stood as both solution and reminder. A solution to the cold, a reminder that every act of survival leaves an imprint, a subtraction, a scar. The bones beneath the wind carried not just warmth, but the memory of extinction. How, then, do you honour what keeps you alive while knowing you are part of its end? Perhaps the answer lies not in words, but in the arrangement of the bones themselves. There is a symmetry in their placement, a solemnity that borders on reverence. These were not the crude stacks of indifferent scavengers. They were compositions, circular, balanced, intentional. Some dwellings show ornamentation, patterns etched into ivory, beads threaded onto sinew, decorative objects buried beneath the floor. It is as if, having taken the bones, the builders returned something: shape, meaning, care. A kind of ritual reciprocity, not to erase the taking, but to acknowledge it. The shelter became not just a structure of survival, but a gesture of gratitude etched into form, and the paradox only deepens. For the very act of survival, warm, firelit nights under mammoth-rib ceilings, depended on the absence of the very creatures that once roamed the plains in herds as vast as weather. The woolly mammoth, once so dominant it shaped ecosystems with its tread, now found itself entwined in the story of another species, a bipedal scavenger turned builder. It is difficult to say when the balance began to shift, when the number of mammoths fell below what was needed for both shelter and renewal. But by the time the last mammoth bone was lifted into place along the Dnieper, the animal's fate was already sealed. The shelters that protected humans were also tombstones, unmarked but undeniable. This does not make the builders villains, it makes them participants in an ancient contract between life and death. The Ice Age was not a passive backdrop. It was a world of scarcity and consequence. Every act had weight. To live meant to take. To build meant to dismantle something else. And within this equation, humans learned to become both creators and witnesses. They shaped a world in their image, but only because the bones of that world allowed them to do so. And once the mammoths were gone, so too were the shelters that relied on them. No other material matched their size, their strength, their availability. The extinction echoed through architecture. Archaeologists debate whether overhunting played a significant role in the mammoth's demise. Climate change certainly strained the ecosystems that supported them. But it is undeniable that their bones became part of a new ecology, not of wild plains, but of hearth circles and windbreaks, not of movement, but of settlement. The homes along the Dnieper are quiet testimony to that exchange. They are made not of stone, which endures, but of bone, which remembers. And in that memory lies a kind of message, that even our earliest innovations bore the cost of disappearance. So what are we looking at when we gaze upon those pale curves in the Ukrainian soil, uncovered after 20,000 years? Are we looking at evidence of genius or evidence of need? Are we seeing the triumph of adaptability, or the foreshadowing of a pattern we still have not broken, a pattern of building tomorrow from the remains of what we can no longer preserve today? When does shelter become elegy? And who will remember the shape of our own walls when the creatures we build them from are gone? The bone huts of the Dnieper don't answer that question. They ask it louder. In their silence, they speak not only of adaptation, but of tension. They embody the fragile choreography between existence and erasure. You step into the remnants of one of these dwellings, and you are stepping into a moment suspended between necessity and consequence. The hearth in the centre still blackens the soil. The outline of tusk still defines the perimeter. You can almost feel the presence of breath inside, warm bodies pressed together, the soft flicker of firelight dancing across curved ivory, and outside always the wind, endless, patient, waiting. These shelters are lessons in material honesty. They are not embellished with illusion. They are not designed to outlast the cold for more than a season or two, but in their rough, impermanent geometry, they contain a clarity we rarely permit ourselves today. That what keeps us safe may also be what we've taken. That what gives us life may be borrowed from something that had to lose it. The mammoth was not just hunted. It was absorbed, metabolized into heat, into structure, into story. And when the storm pressed in, the bone stood between the family and the void. What more sacred task could there be for the remains of a creature than to hold the line between death and breath? There's an intimacy to that kind of architecture. You don't simply build with bone. You live among it. You carry it. You recognize it. You become fluent in the curve of a femur, the thickness of a skull, the subtle fracture lines that might give way under weight. Each part of the animal finds its place in the design, not because of aesthetic whim, but because its shape insists on it. The architecture of the mammoth-bone hut is an echo of the creature's anatomy, rearranged into survival. To look at these structures is to see not only the ingenuity of human builders, but the shadow of the bodies they relied upon. And that shadow lingers. When the wind finds the cracks in our own homes today, when we pile blankets and stoke the furnace and close the doors with a quiet shiver, we're answering to that same fear. The fear that warmth can vanish, that safety is conditional, that nature does not make promises. The Ice Age was more honest about this truth. It forced its inhabitants to acknowledge the line between being and ceasing every single day. To build with bone was to live close to the threshold, to make peace with proximity to death. Yet within that closeness, a strange kind of beauty emerged, not ornamental but structural, not decorative but deliberate. The circular forms of the huts mirrored the circularity of the mammoth's ribcage. The slope of the roofs mirrored the hillocks of snow they were built beneath. The form followed the weather, the body, the moment. How often can we say the same today? When did we last build something that understood both what it was made from and what it was made for? And what happens to a species when it forgets to ask those questions? The bone huts are not simply archaeological finds, they are mirrors. They show us a time when necessity forged intimacy between the living and the dead, between builders and their materials, between survival and its cost. The people along the Dnieper River were not abstract figures in a timeline. They were families, shivering children, weary hunters, elders who had seen too many winters. They dragged the bones of giants across frozen ground not out of morbid fascination, but out of a will to persist. In every tusk set as a doorway, in every rib driven into permafrost, there is a silent testament to ingenuity shaped by grief. Inside these huts, life was not just endured, it was organised. Fire burned in the centre, light spilling across curved ivory walls. Tools were knapped, hides stitched, stories perhaps whispered in languages now lost, and always, around them, the weight of absence. An architecture of extinction holding back the cold. What must it have felt like, at night, to listen to the wind press against those bone walls, to feel the structure tremble, to hear the faint echo of the creature it once was? Did they dream of mammoths in their sleep? Did they feel protected or haunted? This is the paradox at the heart of the bones beneath the wind. Survival built upon absence, warmth drawn from death, shelter crafted from the very bodies of vanished strength. It is a paradox we still live with, though our materials have changed. Steel, concrete, plastic, energy drawn from deep time. We still build our walls from what was once living, still convert the vastness of the world into safety for a few. We still sleep, in a sense, inside the echo of something gone. The mammoth-bone hut is not just prehistory, it is a pattern, and yet within that pattern lies something else, a seed of reflection, of reverence. Perhaps the careful placement of bones was not only structural but ceremonial, a way of acknowledging the animal's gift. Perhaps the adornments found within these huts were offerings, a way of restoring meaning to a transaction that could never be balanced. We cannot know. But what we can see, in the arc of a tusk and the soot of a hearth, is the beginning of an awareness, that our survival is not separate from the world, but entwined with it, that what shelters us marks us. So when you look at a mammoth bone dwelling today, half buried in loess and frost, uncovered by archaeologists after 20 millennia, imagine the wind that once tore at its seams. Imagine the family inside, huddled close to their fire. Imagine the weight of the bones above them, silent witnesses to both the storm and the species who had outlived it. And ask yourself, what are the bones beneath your own wind? What vanished strength do your walls contain? What story will the ruins of your shelter tell thousands of winters from now, when the wind finds them again? The storm did not care what the walls were made of. Wind, sharp as obsidian flakes, scoured the plains, peeled back the breath from lungs, and turned snow into a weapon that stripped flesh from bone. In that pale, howling emptiness, a ring began to rise. Not a fortress, not a monument, but something far older and more intimate. Shelter. For the first time, humans began to shape space itself against the void, assembling bone and hide into closed, sacred circles that held back the world. These were not accidental barricades or makeshift windbreaks. They were architecture, deliberate and solemn, born of need, memory, and the dream of warmth. They began with the bones, always the bones. The builders chose with care, shoulder blades as windshields, massive rib bones arched into curves, long tusks driven into permafrost to form the outer rings. The circle was essential. It was the most stable form, resistant to collapse and easy to insulate. Within these curved walls, humans could gather close, back to back, fire in the centre, snow piled around the perimeter for additional insulation. It was not just structure, it was survival arranged in geometry. How did they know the weight each bone could bear? How did they calculate the angle where tusk met earth, where sinew met gravity? There are no blueprints left to read, but in the silence of each preserved ring lies a logic older than mathematics, the logic of cold, of shelter, of the line between life and absence. But bones alone were not enough. The storm was not just seen, it was felt through every gap, every seam, every tiny shiver of exposed air. So the walls were sealed with the hides of the very creatures whose skeletons framed them. Mammoth skin, thick and heavy, was stretched tight across the bones, anchored with stakes, frozen into place. In some sites, archaeologists have found layering, multiple hides stacked and pressed, creating thick, semi-permeable membranes that trapped warmth and resisted wind. The hides were not just barriers, they were the second skin of the dwelling, flexible, breathable, but strong enough to turn blizzard into whisper. And as the fire crackled inside, as smoke threaded upward through purposefully designed smoke holes, the walls softened. The hide warmed, softened, swayed slightly, not unlike the breathing of something alive. Imagine that. A shelter that breathed. A ring of ribs, a skin of warmth, a circle of flickering flame. Inside, children slept in fur-lined beds. Tools were shaped. Meat dried near the fire. But more than that. Stories were told. Laughter cracked against the bones. Memories were shared. The hut was not only physical protection, it was a container of human continuity. And here, perhaps, lies the deepest truth, that building a shelter was never a solitary act of engineering, but a communal ceremony. Each ring was raised by many hands, each hide hauled and stretched by group effort. The cold was never outwitted alone. And so the shelter became not just a thing, but a ritual, a collective act of defiance and remembrance. What does it mean to build with others, when the alternative is to vanish alone into the snow? In the Ice Age, shelter was not only an invention, it was a ceremony of cooperation. Every circle raised was a map of social memory, a monument to hands that knew their task without the need for speech. To build meant to belong. The bones could not be lifted by one, the hides could not be stretched by a single arm. Children carried tools, elders supervised the weight of ribs. Hunters returned from their journeys not just with meat, but with the materials of continuity. A mammoth, once brought down, was not only a meal, it was a roof, a wall, a future. And so, construction began before the first bone was placed. It began with the decision to stay alive together. It is here, at this intersection of cooperation and necessity, that the circle becomes more than structure. It becomes symbol. A ring encloses, protects, and gathers. There is no corner to hide in, no separation from the warmth or the work. Everything and everyone is included by shape and by intention. Within the circle, distance collapses, and this proximity is no accident. The warmth of a central fire only reaches so far. The human body, shivering in pelts, still emits heat. In a world where temperature could fall below 30 degrees, every breath, every body mattered. The walls weren't just built to keep the wind out. They were built to keep each other in. Some of these shelters, uncovered beneath millennia of silt and frost, measure up to 20 feet in diameter. That is not a survival hut. That is a home. A place where days passed slowly and deliberately, where meat was stored and rationed, where tools were knapped and tested, where tales of past hunts were spoken in the flickering half-light. Archaeologists have found storage pits dug into the floors, smoothed areas where work was done, and soot-stained walls that speak of fires carefully maintained. These are not signs of panic, these are signs of rhythm, of ritual, of seasons planned for, rather than merely endured. And perhaps most strikingly, the more elaborate the structure, the more it suggests something unexpected in such a brutal age. Time. Time to choose bones not for necessity but for fit. Time to arrange hides not only for coverage but for efficiency. Time to sit in the shelter's glow and think. To remember, to grieve, to imagine. The circle gave more than warmth. It gave space for the mind to rest and expand. It carved out a moment from the eternal blizzard and said, "Here we live." In the act of building, people practiced both resilience and vision. They didn't merely react to the cold, they anticipated it. They understood wind direction, drainage, insulation, and the slow, inexorable drift of snow. And through it all, the circle remained. A simple shape, a complex meaning, an agreement that no one would face the elements alone. Not if it could be helped. Not if the bones still held strength. Not if the hide could still stretch one more time across the frame of another winter. Even now, when archaeologists uncover these shelters, often flattened by millennia of ice, buried beneath layers of loess and grass, what remains is not just debris, but outline. The bones lie where they fell, often still in concentric circles, their positions speaking of intention long after purpose has vanished. And in these traces we glimpse the choreography of their making. Large mammoth tusks placed upright, sunk deep into the frozen ground like stakes, ribs bent into arches, forming domes of intersecting lines, smaller bones used as supports, braces, and even shelves, skulls stacked as windbreaks. Sometimes a second ring around the first, a sort of bony skirt to trap drifting snow. The design was not random. Each shelter was a code of anatomical knowledge. The people who built them knew the mammoth intimately, not just how to hunt it, but how to live inside its absence. They understood the curvature of each bone, the grain of frozen hide, the stress points that would fracture under pressure. And in this, the act of building was part art, part memory, part engineering. A kind of skeletal carpentry, done without measuring tools or mortar, and yet producing structures that endured storms more ferocious than most modern dwellings could withstand. Insulation was not an afterthought, but a first principle. After the bones were arranged, they were often layered with earth, packed snow, and above all, hides. Thick mammoth hides could weigh several hundred pounds. They were hauled, unfurled, stretched, and pinned across the structure, sometimes sewn together with sinew, sometimes frozen into place by water and cold. This outer shell transformed the frame from skeleton to skin, sealing heat within and wind without. Over time, as snow piled on top, the dwelling disappeared into the landscape disguised as a mound. Only the rising smoke betrayed the life within. Inside these warm domes, a world unfolded. Fire pits were placed centrally, surrounded by stones or bones to reflect heat. Smoke holes were carefully maintained, sometimes shielded by hide flaps or rings of tusk to prevent collapse. Tools lined the edges, arranged by task or material. Food was cached. Pelts were cured. Infants were swaddled in fur and rocked to sleep near the fire. The walls absorbed the rhythm of the group, their footsteps, their work, their sleep, their breath. And in this quiet, circular world, winter became less of a threat and more of a season to pass through together. In the stillness of those months, the circle became a kind of world in itself. Outside, time belonged to ice, to wolves, to sky. Inside, time belonged to the people, to the slow repetition of tasks, the hush of storytelling, the singing of mothers to their children, the crackle of fat in the fire. If these huts had language, it would not be one of grand declarations, but of small, consistent assurances. You are warm, you are fed, you are not alone. This quiet vocabulary of care is what elevated the shelter from structure to sanctuary. The circle was more than a response to the cold. It was a rehearsal for civilization. Within those curved walls, humans practiced the gestures that would one day shape villages, temples, cities. They gathered, they shared, they remembered, and in doing so, they planted something in the frozen ground that no wind could scatter: continuity. The hut wasn't only a place to sleep, it was a place to become. Consider, too, how building itself became ritual. In the bitter months of scarcity, when food was hard won and days were short, why would a group expend energy on something so elaborate? Because survival, on its own, is not enough. Survival without meaning is erosion, but survival with purpose becomes culture. Every circle of ribs was a commitment, not just to the present, but to a future, a structure raised not only to shield from the blizzard, but to teach the young, to gather the old, to dignify the moment of endurance with intention. There is evidence that construction sites were revisited year after year, sometimes seasonally rebuilt, sometimes expanded. Bones added, hides replaced, floor pits redone, tools cached in the earth, ready for the next return. These weren't emergency shelters scattered by accident. They were part of a memory landscape. They stitched together time, and in doing so they formed something akin to home, even if temporary, even if vanishing under the melt each spring. The act of stretching a hide across a rib cage was not merely utilitarian. It echoed the acts of wrapping, of binding, of enclosing, the same motions one might use to swaddle a child or prepare the body of a lost elder. The motions carried meaning. They acknowledged that what once lived could still protect. And this is not sentiment layered on in hindsight. The care evident in these structures, in how bones were placed with balance, how hides were layered in patterns, how entrances faced away from prevailing winds, tells us that they were not built in haste. They were built with attention. Perhaps the most haunting evidence of this shared labour comes not from the centre of the huts, but from the edges. In several sites, archaeologists have discovered communal middens, piles of discarded tools, broken bones and burnt fragments. Yet within these discards are deliberate deposits, a carefully placed tusk here, a ring of stones there, the remnants of pigment staining bone. These are not just leftovers. They are signs that the act of building and living was accompanied by symbolic gestures, perhaps of gratitude, perhaps of mourning, a ritual layer beneath the practical one. Because survival in the Ice Age was never just about enduring the storm, it was about understanding that endurance meant something only when it was shared. The ring of bones held more than bodies. It held the first sparks of meaning, of belonging, of a world made not just from what was hunted, but from what was held sacred, together. And this sacredness was not written in script nor carved into stone. It was lived, passed through gesture, through participation, through the repetition of acts that taught without words. Each generation that helped raise a shelter was learning more than engineering. They were learning cooperation, trust, and how the weight of one's labour could rest inside the warmth of another's future. The circle demanded this of them, that every person become a part of its making, that no one remained outside the radius of effort or care. Even the act of entering the shelter was symbolic. Many bone huts had low entrances, sometimes so low one had to crawl in. This was not a flaw, but a feature. A small entry conserved heat, yes, but it also required humility. To step inside the circle, you had to bow, to lower yourself, to enter not just a space, but a shared understanding. You came from the storm into a world shaped by others' hands, a world that had been made for you, or because of you, or in anticipation of you. The shelter was a gift in advance, and once inside it became something more than protection. It became memory's cradle. For days, even weeks, entire groups would spend nearly all their time inside. The outside world reduced to the sound of wind beyond the hides and the occasional venture for fuel or food. Time slowed. The fire pulsed steadily, like the heart of the circle. People became closer, literally and figuratively. Speech took on a new cadence. Tasks were shared in silence. Babies learned the faces of the old. Songs may have been invented here, not for performance, but for continuity. Sound passed mouth to mouth like breath. In this slowed, enclosed time, shelter became story. Each mark on the bones, each stain on the hide, each groove from a tool or scratch from a child, accumulated like chapters in a book read only by touch. By the time the shelter was taken down or left behind, as the group moved on with the thaw, it had become a memory, shared not by one person, but by all who had slept within it. The circle endured in their minds, long after the wind reclaimed the site. Today, we look at diagrams of these bone huts in textbooks and museums. We see the lines, the measurements, the labels, mammoth rib, burnt soil, post hole. But to see only the structure is to miss the point. The point is that each circle was a world built from extinction, held together by cooperation, and wrapped in meaning. The point is that shelter was not the absence of danger, but the presence of care. That, in the deepest winter humanity has ever faced, we chose not just to survive, but to survive together. And that choice, to gather, to build, to encircle ourselves with intention, is perhaps the oldest architecture of all, a circle of survival, a beginning that never truly ends. The shelter, for all its ingenuity, was never a guarantee. In the Ice Age, survival was not secured by invention alone, but tested relentlessly by the will of the storm. Blizzards did not simply fall, they arrived like living entities, immense, indifferent, and orchestrated by laws more ancient than bone or fire. Their breath could stretch across entire continents, born of pressure differentials between ice sheets that reached miles into the sky. And when they descended, they came not as gentle snowfalls, but as avalanches of wind, ice, and obliteration. To understand the magnitude of these storms is to understand the scale of what our ancestors faced. Imagine wind driven by atmospheric engines that had no modern equivalent. With ice sheets to the north and warming zones to the south, temperature gradients were violent, sparking pressure waves that birthed storms capable of pushing walls of snow across plains like white tsunamis. The wind could reach speeds high enough to tear loose animal hides from their lashings, to batter bone walls until they bent or shattered, to rip smoke from a fire and leave nothing but darkness in its place. And the cold was not absence but invasion. It crept through gaps, settled into lungs, turned fingers into brittle things. At 40 below zero, with wind howling across the open tundra, frostbite could begin in minutes. Hypothermia in less. But these storms were not merely physical tests, they were existential ones. A well-built hut could provide a microclimate in which heat was retained, food was warmed, and life sustained. But the moment a structural flaw appeared, a seam left open, a hide not weighted enough, a smoke hole left unsealed, the blizzard poured in like a judgment. A family huddled in such a place could go from safety to catastrophe in a single gust. Snow forced into the space would melt and refreeze, sealing entrances. Fires would sputter from lack of oxygen or be smothered by backdraft. In the worst moments, the shelters themselves would collapse beneath the weight of accumulated snow, bones cracking not from age but from the pressure of the sky made solid. What must it have felt like inside that failing circle? To watch the fire flicker its last glow while wind shrieked just inches away, to feel the bones above you strain and groan, to wonder if this structure you had helped raise with your hands would be your tomb. The Ice Age was not generous with warnings, it demanded vigilance, and so failure, when it came, was sudden and often final. But failure was also a teacher, because those who lived learned from the sound of collapse. They studied the places where snow had breached. They noticed which ribs cracked and which held firm. They memorized which hide arrangements flapped and which sealed. And slowly, painfully, generation by generation, they adapted. Not only the design, but the ritual. They came to understand that the storm would never be tamed, only respected, anticipated, and perhaps survived. And so the shelter became not a fortress, but a conversation between human hands and the wild physics of snow and wind. Each storm offered instruction, each failed wall a syllabus. Over time, the people learned to listen more closely to what the storm had to say. It whispered through the cracks, pressed its voice into the seams, left its fingerprints in the frost patterns where warmth tried to escape. And those who endured began to think not only of warmth, but of pressure. Not only of shape, but of tension. They began to sense that survival wasn't just about staying warm, it was about managing the invisible language of force. What could seem like fragile materials, hides, bones, packed snow, became part of a silent engineering tradition, tested by wind that howled like a creature in mourning. Hides were now pegged at tighter intervals, sometimes double-layered where wind tended to sneak in. Bone circles were deepened into the ground, not just placed atop it. Entrances were shaped like tunnels rather than slits, curving inward to reduce the rush of cold air. The fire, once centered solely for heat, now became a diagnostic tool. A flickering flame told stories, where drafts leaked, where heat pooled, where insulation failed. Smoke trails were watched like omens. If they danced toward one side, the builders knew where the storm had found them vulnerable. Still, even with these refinements, nothing was certain. The weather of the Pleistocene world operated beyond expectation. At times, what appeared to be a clear day would twist without warning into a whiteout. A light snowfall could be followed by a sudden drop in pressure, and what had seemed a gentle drift became a suffocating barrage. Visibility could vanish in seconds. In such moments, being caught outside, even just steps away from the shelter, was a death sentence. Entire campsites were designed around this fear, stones placed as path markers, hides strung as guides from shelter to latrine, so no one had to trust their own eyes when the air turned white. And yet they adapted not only with caution, but with creativity. Some groups began using packed snow itself as part of the construction, insulating the outside of bone huts with deliberate mounding, understanding that snow, once compacted and frozen, became its own kind of wall. Others turned to partially subterranean shelters, dug into the earth or riverbanks, where the wind could not reach as fiercely. They used mammoth scapulae, wide, flat shoulder blades, as windbreaks, placing them in arcs around the huts to deflect gusts before they ever reached the walls. Every material had a lesson to offer. Every mistake became an improvement, because to live through the storm was not to overcome it, but to adapt in its shadow. The Ice Age did not reward strength alone, it rewarded memory. Memory embedded not in books, but in construction. Not in words, but in arrangement. The story of each hut was written in its resistance, not its perfection, but its persistence. And what persisted above all was attention. These early builders became students of stress and silence. They learned to read snow not just as threat, but as signal, how it drifted, where it piled, what it weighed. When roofs failed, they studied where the collapse began. When fires went out, they marked the direction of the wind. In one site near the Dnieper, archaeologists found repeated layers of rebuilt shelters, each one slightly improved, slightly more secure, its bones reoriented, its insulation thickened. These were not acts of desperation. They were signs of a developing science, empirical, methodical, passed down through hands. This was not mere architecture. It was a practice of remembering how to lose and how to learn from the loss. Because failure in these conditions was never abstract. It had names, faces, voices. Shelters that gave way in the night were remembered by those who rebuilt them the next morning. The bones of those lost were not removed from the camp, but buried beneath or beside the next structure, not out of morbidity, but because their absence demanded a response. The next hut had to be better, stronger, quieter. The storm in this way did not just destroy, it refined, it instructed. Over generations, the community itself became a kind of storm memory. There may have been no word for aerodynamics, no language for structural integrity, but these concepts were embedded in the way an elder corrected the angle of a rib, or in the way children were taught to press hide smooth before pinning it down. 1,000 such moments made each shelter not just a product of material, but of intergenerational calibration. Sometimes it was the smallest things that proved most effective. A layer of moss placed between hide and bone, a ring of heated stones buried at the perimeter retaining warmth through the night, the strategic placement of a tusk so that snow drifted around rather than into the entrance. These details were not stumbled upon randomly, but slowly honed, each winter sanding away what didn't work. The people didn't just survive the cold, they shaped their culture around learning how to survive it better. But there is also a humility in this process. For all their knowledge, the builders of the Ice Age never came to believe they had mastered the storm. They knew better. Each shelter, no matter how well made, was provisional. It was never mistaken for permanence. That's why the bones could be reused, the hides repaired, the site abandoned and returned to. There was no illusion of triumph, only of partnership with a force that could not be bargained with. In that humility lay their resilience. They did not see the storm as an enemy to be conquered. They saw it as a teacher to be endured. One who arrived unannounced, demanded silence, and left behind lessons carved not in stone, but in the thin warmth of those who were still alive. And those survivors, those listeners to the wind, became, in time, transmitters of knowledge. What they carried was not just the memory of storms, but the knowledge of how to stand through them, together. The fire in the centre was no longer enough. The structure around it, the choice of every rib and every rope, had become just as vital. And in the telling, in the whispering of which angle worked, of which curve shed snow best, they passed on something more powerful than fire, foresight. But even foresight had limits. In certain winters, when the cold was deeper and the sky never cleared, foresight became prayer. There were blizzards so complete they erased sound, so sustained they exhausted even the cleverest shelters. Stories exist, carried through oral tradition, and now echoed faintly in the archaeological record, of camps buried entirely, not by failure but by overmatch. Shelters sealed in by drifts that never melted, leaving bones and artifacts preserved like time capsules. Some of these sites have been excavated thousands of years later, their quiet interiors offering a strange kind of grace. A hearth still darkened by soot, a circle of ribs still upright, a spindle of sinew still wrapped tight. These were not ruins of failure, but echoes of bravery, a final architecture that held even as everything outside it dissolved. What this teaches us, what the Ice Age teaches us, is that adaptation is not a final state. It is an ongoing ritual. Even the best idea is only the best until the next storm proves otherwise. So adaptation becomes a rhythm, a cycle of build, break, learn, build again. Those who could not tolerate this rhythm did not persist. Those who saw failure as a rebuke faded from the lineage. But those who understood that the wind was only ever asking one thing, "Will you try again?" were the ones who moved forward. This is how blizzards became collaborators. Not through kindness, but through consistency. They could be counted on to arrive. They would always test the same seams, always pull at the same corners, and in that predictability the people found patterns. They found edges that could be softened, vulnerabilities that could be prepared for, not solved but anticipated, like knowing a story's ending and still choosing to listen. It's worth pausing here, in this part of the journey, to consider what kind of intelligence this was. It wasn't the intelligence of invention, it was the intelligence of endurance, a slow, quiet, deeply attentive intelligence, one that worked through observation, through iteration, through shared labour, the kind that sits with failure and does not flinch, the kind that looks at a shattered wall of bones and begins, wordlessly, to rebuild. Because in a world where the wind never stops speaking, wisdom belongs to those who keep listening, even when it howls, even when it hurts, even when it takes everything but the will to begin again. And so the blizzard became not just a force to endure, but a teacher whose lessons shaped the very architecture of humanity. Each storm carved knowledge into bone and hide, into the posture of those who bent low to secure a tusk, into the hands of children who watched their elders sew seams tight against the wind. The ordeal was constant, but so too was the learning. From the physics of airflow to the texture of frozen earth, the storm's curriculum was vast and unrelenting, and the only tuition was experience, sometimes at a terrible price. The physics of Ice Age storms, reconstructed now by climatologists and archaeologists, confirm what these people must have sensed in their bodies. Sudden pressure shifts could drive katabatic winds, cold air cascading from the high ice sheets at ferocious speeds, funneling down into river valleys where settlements were built, temperature gradients of 40 degrees in a day. Snowfall measured not in inches but in feet. Drifts so dense they behaved like sculpted ice rather than powder. No material then available could stand against that without flaw. Yet each winter, the builders tried anyway. Each season, they refined. They learned to test hides with their hands, stretching and pulling to feel weak spots. They banked snow deliberately along the windward sides of their shelters to build counterpressure. They dug pits at doorways to catch blown-in snow before it reached the living space. They weighted the base of hides with stones and bones, inventing anchors before the word existed. And when a hut collapsed, they salvaged what they could, learned, and built again. The blizzard's destruction became the blueprint for the next attempt. But what is most remarkable about this ordeal is not the engineering. It is the spirit behind it. The willingness to adapt was not only practical, it was communal. When a shelter failed, it was everyone's loss, and when it was rebuilt, it was everyone's work. In this way, the storm shaped not just structures but societies. It taught them that survival could not be an individual project. The blizzard's howl was a reminder. Only the circle endures. Only together can the lessons hold. Even now, standing over the archaeological remains of these huts, you can feel that echo. The ring of bones, the scatter of stones, the blackened soil at the centre, all of it testifies to a rhythm of trial and revision. These were not static shelters. They were living experiments, each one a negotiation with the invisible hand of the atmosphere. And though many failed, each failure thickened the weave of knowledge that would one day allow humans to thrive in nearly every climate on Earth. So when we speak of the Ice Age as ordeal, we must also speak of it as apprenticeship. The howling blizzard was the first architect, the first critic, the first stern teacher of design, and the people who listened, who built and rebuilt, emerged not just as survivors but as learners, carrying forward an understanding that endures long after the wind has stilled. Before architecture was beauty, it was breath. Before it was vision, it was warmth. And before it was ambition, it was desperation, the quiet, urgent kind that begins in the marrow and spreads outward like frost crawling across a frozen wall of hide. In the Ice Age world, every shelter was first a response. Not to comfort, not to dreams, but to cold. The kind of cold that buried stars behind clouds and turned breath into crystals that fell back onto your skin. In this world, survival did not reward the cleverest invention or the strongest back. It rewarded the most observant, the most stubborn, the most willing to layer the world around them into armour. How do you turn the body of the earth into a second skin? How do you layer meaning into moss, memory into mud, safety into sinew? In the deep winters of the Upper Paleolithic, this was not a metaphor. It was a method. We see it now in the dark stains beneath ancient settlements, where compacted peat and moss once insulated the ground beneath shelters. We see it in the faint outlines of hide panels pressed by centuries into subsoil, and we see it in the gaps, or lack thereof, between overlapping ribs and tusks, where clever hands filled the voids with packed loam, woven reeds, even snow itself hardened into wall. Each layer was not just a material, but a memory, a message passed from body to body, moss that held in warmth, because someone had once noticed the way it grew thickest near spring-fed stones. Hides stretched with tension not for decoration but to create air pockets, invisible shields against wind and damp. Earth piled at the base of walls not to stabilise but to thicken the distance between inside and out, to blur the line where the blizzard could end. These were not artistic choices. They were revisions in an ongoing manuscript written with bones and breath and bitter weather. But even this manuscript had structure. The shelters were no longer accidents of necessity. They were becoming patterns, recurring blueprints not drawn but remembered. What began as emergency improvisation was hardening into form, into something that could be taught, copied, rebuilt. The layering of hides was no longer random. It followed logic. The thickest at the base, the more supple atop to flex with wind. Moss beneath, dry leaves above to wick moisture. Earth last, a final sealant. The skin of the planet itself used to hold warmth in a fragile womb of life. These methods were not shared through diagrams or blueprints. They were shared through hands, through watching, through doing. A child watching her mother press clumps of moss into a seam would, years later, repeat the gesture in a storm of her own. A man recalling where the shelter's warmest corner had been would rebuild the wall just a few inches thicker. Each improvement, however small, was a memory preserved not in stone, but in shelter. And when memory lives in walls, what kind of legacy begins to form? It is not the kind carved into monuments or etched in symbols. It is subtler, a legacy of warmth, of stillness, of the brief suspension of fear inside a space that holds heat. These early architects, if we can call them that, were not designing to impress. They were designing to survive. And so, their genius lay not in grandeur, but in precision, in knowing where the cold seeped in and how to slow it. One of their most elegant adaptations was the reshaping of entrances, not simply as doorways, but as valves in the architecture of heat. Heat, as they learned, was not lost equally. It escaped in streams, drawn toward the cold like breath into a vacuum. A single gap, a poor seam, a straight path through a wall. These were vulnerabilities the storm exploited, and so, gradually, Ice Age families began to shape their entries not as holes in the wall, but as passages with intention, a curved entrance that turned before it met the interior, a lowered threshold so the warm air pooled above, an extra hide flap weighted and tucked to break the wind before it reached the heart of the home. These were not accidents. They were observations refined into form. The interior of a mammoth-bone hut might be no larger than a modern bedroom, but its thermal logic was astonishing. The warmest spot was often furthest from the fire, not because the flame failed, but because the shelter succeeded. Warmth collected in corners, in hollows beneath bedding, in air trapped between hanging hides. Entrances designed like animal burrows preserved this equilibrium. The cold could enter, but it could not pass without being tamed. We know this now because we can model it. In wind tunnels and thermal simulations, researchers have recreated these ancient shelters and tested their efficiency. They have found that the curved entryways could reduce heat loss by over 60%, that the layered hides, properly overlapped, created a breathable membrane, keeping warmth in, letting moisture out, that the slope of the ceiling encouraged convection, cycling air without opening the space to drafts. In short, these were not crude shelters. They were the early experiments of minds tuned to consequence. But what stands out more than the science is the spirit behind it. The willingness to build not just once, but again and again, and better each time, to see the draft at your feet and imagine a wall reshaped, to feel the warmth drift upward and imagine a ceiling lowered. These were the architects of necessity, and their drawings were made in memory, in muscle, in the daily rehearsal of shelter. Because each mistake meant someone had shivered. Each improvement meant someone had slept through the night. These choices were not technical, they were ethical. They were the architecture of care, of community, of the refusal to let cold have the last word. And in time, these acts of care became codified, not in written language, but in repetition. What one generation learned by enduring, the next inherited by watching. The knowledge of how to survive a blizzard was passed not as lecture, but as rhythm. A boy learning to lash sinew around bone would do so with his grandfather's hands guiding his own. A girl observing the packing of moss into seams would mimic the movements by instinct, not by instruction. These gestures became grammar, the huts became sentences, and together they formed a language of survival that stretched across generations without ever being spoken aloud. In this way, shelter itself became memory, not static, but alive. Each new structure bore the fingerprints of its builders, but it also carried the wisdom of the dead. The wind might change, the snow might deepen, but the core ideas endured. Block the draft, seal the seam, trap the heat. These were the lessons that came not from intellect alone, but from intimacy with the land and the weather and one another. We see the evidence of this slow mastery in the archaeological record, not just in the bones and hides that remain, but in their arrangement. Across the steppes of Eastern Europe, particularly near the Dnieper and Don rivers, we find mammoth bone huts that are not singular, but clustered, circular in plan, with similar orientations and repeated structural decisions. This suggests not isolated invention, but shared knowledge. Not one clever individual, but many families learning together. The shelters form a community, and the community becomes the real structure. And this is where the architecture of necessity expands beyond physics. Because to build these shelters, to gather the bones, stretch the hides, pack the seams, required many hands. The cold was a communal enemy, and survival a collective task. There is no such thing as a solitary hut in the deepest winter. Even if a family built alone, they survived together. They exchanged ideas the way they exchange warmth, through proximity, through participation, through presence. The result was a kind of architecture that defies modern categories. It was neither private nor public, neither permanent nor temporary. It was something else, responsive, living, iterative. A form of building not driven by ego or artistry, but by listening. Listening to the wind, listening to the soil, listening to the stories told over smoke about the shelter that once held, or the one that failed, and then choosing to do it better. In this way, architecture became tradition, not static but self-correcting. The hut you built as a child would one day be rebuilt by your daughter. The curve of the entrance, the way the moss was layered, the way the fire's smoke was guided upward, all of it would outlive you, carried forward not in monuments, but in memory shaped into shelter. And what more intimate monument could there be? These were homes born not from blueprints but from experience. They were made not just of materials but of lessons, stacked layer upon layer like the hides that sealed them, the moss that softened them, the earth that weighed them down against the wind. And just as each material served a physical function, each also carried the weight of remembered struggle. A shelter was not only built, it was inherited, revised, and reimagined across time. To understand this, we need to look at the small details, the decisions that suggest refinement through use. Consider the use of internal partitions, not walls in the way we think of them, but modest dividers built from bundled branches or hides. These were not only for privacy or organisation, they redirected airflow, slowed the escape of warmth, and created thermal zones within the space. Families could sleep huddled on the inner side behind the buffer, where the air was still and warm. They didn't stumble upon this by chance, it was learned. Through trial, through discomfort, through improvement. Even the layering techniques used for insulation reflect a sophisticated grasp of materials. Hides were chosen carefully. The inner layers, softer, pliable, better at trapping air. Outer layers, thicker, more weather-resistant, more rigid. Between them, moss and dry grasses created loft, the hidden heart of any insulative system. Sometimes they added a final layer of earth, packed gently to hold it all down and protect it from wind shear. Each of these components did a job, but together they made something greater, a barrier not just to cold, but to despair. Because that's what this architecture guarded against. Despair. The blizzard outside was indifferent, but the shelter, the fire, the ritual of building, these were acts of resistance. Every winter brought new variables, deeper snow, sharper wind, shorter daylight. But the knowledge inside the hut accumulated like warmth. It gathered in the rafters, in the hearthstones, in the way the door flap was tucked. It was there, silent and faithful, when a storm howled at night and the walls held. It was there in the breath of sleeping children, in the faint scent of moss warming under fur, in the low crackle of fire-licking stone. We often imagine our ancestors as rugged individualists, but this architecture tells another story, of collectives, of shared burdens, of innovation born not in comfort, but in the deep pressure of need. When we find their dwellings today, collapsed and buried, we are not just unearthing structures, we are uncovering decisions, iterations, improvements passed hand to hand. It's easy to miss the elegance, the rings of tusks, the soot-blackened soil, the broken bones. They speak softly, but they speak of mastery. And so the codification of knowledge wasn't a declaration. It was a practice, a repetition. Each shelter whispered to the next, and in doing so they built not just warmth, but wisdom. And this whispering continued not only in the act of building, but in the quiet rituals that surrounded it. The way stones were arranged around a hearth, the way entrances faced away from prevailing winds, the way the floor was lined with reeds, not just for comfort, but for drainage, for hygiene, for the long-term habitability of a structure that in some cases stood for years. These were not just solutions, they were traditions. And tradition, in the Ice Age, was a kind of technology, a cultural insulation that buffered families from the chaos of climate. When we stand today among the remains of these homes, it's easy to overlook this. The bones have fallen inward, the hides long gone, the moss returned to the soil, but the pattern is still there. The circle remains. The imprint of decisions lingers in the arrangement of ribs, the depth of post holes, the darkened soil of hearths that once burned through winter after winter. These are the shadows of architecture, and yet they reveal so much. What they reveal most clearly is that knowledge itself became part of the shelter, passed not in words but in acts, in watching someone lay down the first branch, in joining in the layering of hide and earth, in the muscle memory of stretching sinew taught between tusks. This knowledge was stored in people, not paper. It moved through generations like smoke curling upward, unseen but essential. And because it lived in practice, it adapted. Every winter, new lessons. Every failure, a refinement. Every success, a story. And these stories mattered. Around the hearth, children heard not only myths and memories, but accounts of past shelters, of the year the fire wouldn't stay lit, of the wall that caved during a thaw, of the time Uncle Coo carved a vent hole too wide and they all nearly froze. These stories, humorous or haunting, were instruction disguised as narrative. They wrapped engineering in empathy. In this way, the shelter was more than a structure. It was a school, a repository of history, a place where necessity slowly, invisibly, became intelligence. So when we call these Ice Age families architects of necessity, we are not diminishing their creativity. We are naming the condition in which that creativity became indispensable. They did not build for beauty, though beauty sometimes happened. They did not innovate for prestige, though some innovations endured for millennia. They built because they had to, and in doing so, carefully, collaboratively, again and again, they turned necessity into a form of genius. And so here, beneath the snow and bones and time, we begin to understand something quiet and profound, that the history of architecture is not the history of stone, or cities, or grand design. It is the history of insulation, of entranceways, of warmth shared in the dark. It is, at its core, the story of people who refused to freeze and taught others how not to. What happens when survival gives way to stillness? When the threat is held at bay, the fire is steady, and the snow falls gently outside a wall that will not collapse. In these moments, something quietly extraordinary unfolds. The shelter no longer merely protects life. It begins to nurture it. And at the centre of this transformation, glowing softly in the dark, is the hearth. It is here, beside the fire, that Ice Age families laid down the burdens of constant motion. Here that they cooked and carved, rested and remembered. Across tens of thousands of years, archaeologists have found the blackened soil of ancient hearths, circles of scorched earth tucked into the floors of mammoth-bone huts or cave alcoves, their soot still staining the rock. Around these blackened centres they found more. Bones cracked for marrow, shells burned open, ash mingled with splinters of flint. Traces of meals, of preparation, of people not merely surviving, but sharing. What does it mean to share a meal in a world so precarious? The answer may lie in the care with which these hearths were maintained. The stones placed to contain them were not tossed, but arranged. The spaces around them were cleared, swept, insulated with hides or layered grasses. This was not haphazard. This was tradition, and tradition, even at its most improvised, is a signal. Here is meaning. Here is memory. Here is a place not only of necessity, but of culture. But fire alone does not create culture. It is what gathers around it that matters. Families sat in rings, cross-legged or crouched, passing roasted bone and sinew, their silhouettes flickering against hide walls, and in those flickers stories moved. Not stories in the way we know them, not written, not even spoken in full, but in gestures, in tone, in the rhythmic cadence of voice rising and falling like flame. Perhaps this is where language deepened, where vocabulary stretched to hold not just names for things, but the shape of a memory, the echo of a sorrow, the sound of a lesson. Could it be that the hearth is where the past first became portable? That as warmth pooled within the walls of shelter, so too did narrative? We know from the charred remains that meals were varied, not just meat, but roots and nuts, shellfish and seeds, stews and roasts. The diversity of ingredients suggests foresight, planning, exchange. But more than that, it suggests rhythm, seasons, repetition. What is a meal? Repeated across winters, if not ritual. And what does ritual do, if not draw people together across time? The hearth was more than a fire. It was an axis of warmth, of attention, of meaning. Around it, hands moved in cooperation. Bodies leaned close, and perhaps most importantly, eyes met. In the midst of the longest winters the world has ever known, this small circle of light became the first theatre, the first council, the first sanctuary. Not just where life was sustained, but where life began to be understood. Archaeological evidence tells us this understanding left its fingerprints in the soil. Around the hearths of Ice Age dwellings, we find patterns of activity, concentric circles of debris and artifacts radiating outward like ripples from a stone dropped into water. The innermost circle holds the ash and charcoal of the fire itself. The next ring, animal bones split for marrow, cracked by practiced hands. Beyond that, Tools, scrapers, awls, blades, blackened at the tips, perhaps from stirring a stew or shifting embers. This isn't random scattering, it's organisation, a spatial choreography built around the glow of a flame. And at the very edges of these living spaces, archaeologists sometimes find objects that hint at something more than practical life. Tiny beads carved from ivory, ochre-stained pebbles, fragments of figurines. They are not arranged like tools, they are tucked away, hidden or placed deliberately in hearthside niches. Some are burned, as if offered to the fire. Others show signs of handling, smoothed by touch, marked by cuts. These objects speak softly of meaning beyond function. Tokens, charms, perhaps prayers. Even in a world of scarcity, there was room for the symbolic. Even amid the storm, people reached for the intangible. Inside these shelters, the hearth became not only a centre for food, but a stage for memory. The firelight extended the day, allowing stories to spill beyond daylight's limit. It is not hard to imagine the youngest watching, eyes reflecting flame, as elders mimed hunts, retold near misses, recounted ancestors' journeys. In the flicker of orange and shadow, gestures took on weight. A tilt of the head could mean danger. A rhythmic tapping could evoke the sound of hooves across snow. This was oral tradition in its first cradle, not just passing information, but creating belonging. Meals, too, took on a ritual character. Evidence of large roasting pits and communal cooking suggests these were not private affairs, they were shared events. Even when food was scarce, it was distributed, portioned, passed. And in the act of passing, something subtle happened. A reinforcement of trust, of obligation, of connection. A line of survival stretching from hunter to child, from elder to infant, from past to future. Each bite of marrow, each handful of roasted root, reaffirmed a social contract stronger than the hides holding the walls. The hearth, in this sense, was not simply a utilitarian centre. It was a social engine, pulling people inward, holding them in orbit, forging bonds as vital as warmth. Without it, a family might survive. With it, a community could emerge. The fire's heat was literal, but its glow was metaphorical. A small, steady axis around which lives spun, stories formed, and identities coalesced. The Ice Age shelter was not just a shield from the elements, it was a school of being human. And as in any school, certain spaces became sacred, not by decree but by repetition, by the quiet consensus of generations. The hearth was one such space. Its light didn't just chase away the dark, it defined the space within which culture took root. Around it, people did more than eat or warm themselves. They decorated tools, repaired clothing, braided sinew, shaped memory into objects. The slow rhythm of daily life settled here, in the circle of warmth, like sediment at the bottom of a pond, subtle, layered, enduring. This is where the symbolic world began to bloom. The objects found near hearths, far from being ornamental afterthoughts, suggest an emerging interior life, a pierced shell, far from any ocean, a carved fragment of antler shaped like a bird. Small things, easily lost, carefully kept. These weren't tools in the strictest sense. They were ideas made solid, emblems maybe of identity, memory or hope. Perhaps they marked a child's birth, a successful hunt, the passing of a loved one. We will never know exactly, but the presence of these objects hints at something tender, that amid hunger and cold people still found room to wonder. It's in these moments, the quiet, deliberate placement of a bead or the staining of a stone with ochre, that we see the earliest echoes of ritual. Not the large, performative rituals of later civilizations, but something more intimate, personal, perhaps even private. A mother leaving a carved figure near her sleeping child. A hunter tracing a familiar symbol into the soot-darkened wall before stepping into the storm. A gesture toward meaning, made not for an audience, but for the self, or for something unseen. The hearth enabled this introspection because it made time stretch. Where once dusk meant retreat, firelight allowed for hours of reflection. Time to fix, to decorate, to remember. The cave or hut became a womb of flickering thought, where generations could coexist, the elder speaking, the child listening, the past breathing softly alongside the present. The firelight illuminated faces, yes, but it also lit the inward space where story and identity began to take form. Even in death, the hearth held power. In some dwellings, burials took place within the shelter near the fire. This was not accidental. It bound the departed to the circle of the living. It honoured the idea that warmth, both physical and emotional, was not to be surrendered easily. In this way, the hearth was a thread through life and death, presence and absence, a space where one might whisper to the fire and imagine that someone, still listened. And so the humble hearth, little more than stone and flame, became the heart not just of the shelter, but of the human story itself. It drew people inward, then upward, towards something larger, something we still carry with us, glowing behind every closed door, at the centre of every home. That glow was never merely about warmth, it was about orientation, not in the geographic sense, but the emotional. The hearth provided a point around which the mind could organise experience. In a world defined by flux, changing seasons, migrating herds, and unpredictable weather, the fire stayed. It burned at the centre, it gathered people, it offered continuity. And from that continuity came cohesion. People did not merely survive together, they came to understand themselves as a unit, a we, not just a me. This shift was foundational. We see this transformation not just in objects or ash layers, but in space itself. The layout of Ice Age dwellings begins to reflect intentional design centred around the fire. Sleeping areas radiated outward from the hearth like spokes on a wheel. Storage zones developed in colder corners. Tools were cached in predictable patterns, reachable by hand from seated positions. The structure itself, whether built from mammoth ribs, wood, or dug into the earth, was an extension of the fire's geometry. Life was quite literally organised around flame. This centering of the hearth made it something more than functional. It made it sacred. The word sacred does not require gods or temples. It requires only the repeated act of placing value, emotional, social, spiritual, on a space. And that's exactly what the hearth received. It became the locus of memory, the setting for disputes and reconciliations, the place where stories were not only told but created. It witnessed the first laughter, the first lullabies, the silent weeping for those lost to cold or hunger. It was the most human space in a deeply inhuman world. And as the hearth became the stage for human experience, it also shaped our biology. The warmth it provided allowed for lighter clothing, deeper sleep, and greater safety, all of which contributed to improved health, longer lifespans, and more stable child-rearing. With firelight, infants could be watched through the night. With warm shelters, the sick could be tended, the injured could heal. The hearth enabled not only connection but care, and care too is a technology. A soft one, but no less powerful. In this way, the hearth gave rise to a different kind of resilience. Not just physical endurance, but emotional stamina. It gave people the space to process hardship, to recalibrate, to sit together in silence or song. Over time, these gatherings carved grooves into the cultural landscape. They laid the groundwork for empathy, for storytelling, for the shared sense of what it means to belong. The hearth, in its gentle constancy, taught humans how to be with each other, not just for protection, but for presence. And presence, once kindled, does not extinguish easily. It burns on, in ritual, in memory, in the inherited warmth of language itself. The hearth was the first architecture of meaning, not a structure of walls and roofs, but of moments, built one shared fire at a time. And perhaps this is the most enduring lesson the hearth gave to those early Ice Age families. That meaning is not something vast or distant, but something woven into the fabric of daily life. It is the smell of cooked meat rising with steam into the cold air. It is the softness of a sleeping child beside a glowing bed of coals. It is the rustle of hide as someone adjusts a flap to keep the wind out, or the quiet voice of an elder reciting a story as the snow falls beyond the bone walls. These were not grand moments, but they were foundational. Repeated across centuries, across regions, across countless nameless people, they formed the early architecture of intimacy. Archaeologists have found evidence of this intimacy not only in the objects left behind, but in the placement of bodies. In some shelters, skeletons lie curled beside what was once a hearth. In others, animal skulls have been placed near the fire, perhaps not for fuel, but for memory. A talisman, a companion, a marker. These gestures are small, but they speak loudly. They speak of grief, yes, but also of belonging. They speak of people who did not only fear the dark, but who filled it with meaning. The hearth was a container for that meaning. It was where knowledge was passed, about hunting roots, edible plants, tool-making techniques, or changing weather. But also where less tangible knowledge was born, emotional fluency, symbolic thought, humour, even silence shared and understood. It was a space where children learned not just how to survive, but how to interpret a face, a gesture, a story, a dream. In many ways, the hearth taught people how to be not only human, but humane. In the grand arc of history, the Ice Age hearths might seem modest. There are no towering walls or monolithic sculptures here, just circles of ash, scatterings of bone, burnt stones blackened with smoke, and yet within those humble rings lie the roots of everything that would come after. Religion, art, kinship, myth, the idea of home, all of it, all of us, begins there, around a fire set against the howl of the wind. And so, when we light candles today, or gather around the kitchen stove, or sit by a fireplace with those we love, we are not merely engaging in comfort. We are participating in a lineage that stretches back through millennia, through blizzards and bone walls, through hunger and hope, a lineage of circles, of warmth, of storytelling. In the end, the hearth was never just about fire. It was about focus, a centre around which life could arrange itself into meaning. It was the first invitation into culture, into reflection, into community. And though the snow still falls and the wind still rise somewhere, always, there is a fire burning, a heart beating quietly beneath the sheltering dark, a place to return to, a place to begin. The storm howled like memory itself, vast and unrelenting, scouring the world outside with the blind fury of ice and wind. But here, within the crude dome of hide and bone, a new silence had begun to take shape, not the silence of cold or death, but the silence that comes before creation. For as long as there had been fire, there had been shadows. And now, as the blizzards outside carved white scars across the earth, the walls inside became the canvas of something unexpected, the human imagination. Why did they begin to paint? Somewhere deep in a cave, protected by stone and time, a hand dipped in ochre pressed itself against the wall. It left not a decoration, but a declaration. I am here. I was here. I survived. These early images, a bison in motion, of mammoths hunted, of antlered spirits caught between man and beast, were not born in the open. They did not flutter in wind nor face the sun. They were hidden. Encased in dark, protected spaces, spaces that echoed not only with shelter, but with something sacred. The shelters that guarded bodies from cold now also held a different kind of fire, the fire of symbol, the heat of story. Did the blizzard teach them to imagine? Inside those shelters, within the bones of mammoth and the stretch of stitched hides, the mind had room to wander. No longer forced to move with every shift in the wind, the body became still, and in that stillness something stirred, a new kind of seeing, a new kind of memory. When survival is no longer the only measure of life, what fills the empty hours? What grows in the spaces between hunger and sleep? Perhaps the answer is story. Perhaps the answer is symbol. Perhaps the cold outside was so complete, so unforgiving, that the only way to push back was not with muscle or tool, but with meaning. And so the walls, once mere barriers against wind, became stages. The shadows cast by flickering firelight danced upon them, merging with pigments, carving beasts from smoke and thought. Archaeologists uncover these places today with reverence, as though entering shrines. They find soot-stained ceilings, pigment crushed from mineral, and symbols repeated again and again, as if repetition itself was a ritual, a chant not spoken but painted. And amid these signs, what emerges is not a single hand, but many. The echo of generations layering thought atop thought, each stroke a thread in an invisible tapestry of survival. Was it art? Was it prayer? Was it both? We do not know, but we know it mattered. Because to use precious pigment, to risk crawling deep into caves by flickering light, to spend hours shaping forms no one might ever see, is not the act of someone seeking luxury. It is the act of someone seeking understanding, of someone who stood in the warmth of shelter while death circled just beyond the wall and chose not only to live, but to remember. And in that remembering, imagination found a boundary to lean against. The blizzard outside was not just weather, it was chaos itself, shifting, howling, unpredictable, larger than any one life. But inside the shelter the walls stood firm, the fire burned steady. Here, within the ring of ribs or the hollow of a cave, chaos met its first true boundary. Order could begin, and in that small but powerful gap humans began to create. The relationship between safety and imagination is as old as this moment, when danger recedes just far enough to allow breath. The mind begins to wander. Freed from the relentless urgency of flight or hunger, it starts to play, to shape visions, to recall hunts in arcs of pigment, to dream of animals unseen but imagined. Shelter became more than a container for bodies. It became an incubator for thought. The same walls that trapped heat also trapped stories, memories, and possibilities. They kept them from scattering like snow in the wind. Archaeologists have long noted how early art appears most frequently in hidden or enclosed spaces. The back chambers of caves, the interior walls of shelters, the places furthest from the elements. The lines and symbols drawn there are not random. They cluster where the firelight can dance, where shadows elongate and move. In these darkened interiors, flame becomes both illumination and brush. Its shifting light animates the static pigment, turning painted bison into moving herds, transforming handprints into gestures reaching out from the past. The artists may not have had a word for it, but they understood its power. They understood that the space between flicker and form could hold magic. And so, a new kind of ritual was born. Not just the ritual of building, but the ritual of imagining. A family huddled near the hearth might watch as an elder. Fingers stained red or black traced a shape onto hide or wall. Perhaps it was a record of a successful hunt, or a story of a spirit encountered in a dream. Perhaps it was simply a way of passing time, a rhythm for the hand to match the rhythm of the fire's crackle. Whatever its origin, the act of making symbol out of chaos became its own defiance. A way of saying this is our world too, not just outside, but inside. Not just storm, but story. This is how the shelter's function expanded again. It was no longer only a boundary between wind and flesh. It became a boundary between disorder and meaning. A small, warm stage on which the first performances of humanity unfolded, lit by a fire that doubled as both heat and spotlight, both survival and imagination spark. And in time, these performances deepened. They became layered, not only in pigment or stroke, but in thought. The animals drawn on cave walls weren't always what was eaten. Sometimes they were dangerous, even sacred. A rhinoceros with its horn elongated, a bird-headed man, a bison pierced not by spears, but by abstract lines. These were not hunting records. They were stories, symbols, maybe warnings, maybe blessings. And crucially, they were made inside, behind walls. Their placement suggests something private, something chosen, a turning inward that could only happen once the cold was kept out. The shelter allowed for this turning. It held space for more than mere existence. When the howling world was shut away, when hunger had been met for the night, people could sit and think. And when thought has time to root, it grows strange and luminous things. Symbols began to appear, not just animals but shapes, spirals, crosshatches, dots and grids, some repeated across regions separated by miles and years. What did they mean? We don't know, but they meant something. They were carried, preserved, repeated, taught. And all of it began on the walls, the safe, inner walls of shelters built to outlast the wind. Inside these circles of bone and hide, the first abstract thoughts were made durable. Imagine a child tracing their fingers along one of these symbols while the fire cracked nearby. Imagine the elder explaining not just what it was, but what it meant, or what it used to mean. A story within a story, memory wrapped in warmth. These dwellings became more than spaces of protection. They became vaults of culture. And in that quiet transmission, from hand to wall, from mouth to ear, a new layer of human resilience was born. Continuity. Not just surviving the storm, but surviving it with stories intact. We sometimes think of prehistory as dark and brutal. But perhaps that's because we look only at the outside, at the wind, the snow, the hunt. Step inside, and it is different. It is lit with coals and voices. It is shaped by hands pressing colour into stone. There is music, of bone flutes, of rhythmic tapping, of words patterned into song. There is teaching, not just how to build, but how to remember. The shelter becomes not just a refuge, but a library, a cathedral, a studio. And what separated these early humans from the cold was not just the wall, but the meaning that grew on it, the stories whispered beside it, the dreams dreamt under its roof. The chaos of the outside world had to be answered, not just with warmth, but with wonder. And in the echoes of those first markings, that first firelit art, we find the spark of everything that would follow: myth, language, belief. The world outside was indifferent, but inside humans made a mirror, a surface to reflect themselves, not only what they were, but what they might become. Because the act of making meaning is never neutral. To take the storm, that endless roaring whiteness, and contrast it with the vivid interior of a shelter is to divide the world. To name one space as sacred, one space as human. That distinction mattered. It mattered in how people moved, how they shared, how they began to see the world not just as a place to endure, but as a place to shape. The shelter was a kind of defiance. But the art on its walls, that was a declaration, a line drawn between chaos and intention, a threshold crossed not with the feet, but with the imagination. It is no coincidence that the earliest signs of belief, of ritual, of story, arise in tandem with shelter. When we protect the body, we make space for the soul. That soul, fragile, flickering, needs more than food. It needs symbols, it needs rhythm, it needs to see itself in something larger. So it draws, so it carves, so it tells. Within bone circles and hollowed caves, the great interior life of humanity took shape, not by accident, but because shelter made it possible. And consider this. Many of the cave sites where early art is found, like Chauvet or El Castillo, are not places where people lived day to day. They required effort to reach, often plunging deep into dark rock. And yet, people went. They carried torches, pigments, children. They painted animals in motion. They traced outlines of their own hands. What did they seek deep underground? It was not safety alone. It was a space that echoed back their own presence. A space where symbols could live, undisturbed. A kind of inner chamber. Not unlike the hearth at the centre of a shelter. A place where the wildness outside was held at bay. These sacred interiors may have been inspired by the sheltering structures of everyday life. Or perhaps the two were one and the same, spiritual and physical protection woven together. In either case, the point remains. Once humans had the ability to define a boundary, they began to fill that boundary with meaning. The blizzard still raged, but inside there were painted horses. There were dotted spirals. There were songs and stories, and silence too, the reverent kind that comes when a community listens together. Shelter, in this sense, became not just architectural, it became philosophical. A wall was not just a defence against snow, it was a canvas for memory. A place to say, we are not only shaped by nature, we shape back. We answer the wind not just with tools, but with symbols, with beauty, with myth. It is inside these first sanctuaries that we see the early outlines of everything to come. The human urge not merely to survive, but to belong, to imagine, to matter. Because what begins as shelter against the elements becomes shelter for the spirit. And slowly, through smoke and pigment and story, the walls become more than boundaries. They become mirrors. In the flicker of firelight, in the pulse of shared song, in the hush that falls over a room when someone tells a story that touches memory, the structure becomes sacred. Not by design, perhaps, but by use. These were not temples built to honour gods. They were homes built to hold life, and in holding life they nurtured meaning. Imagine the scent inside such a space. Smoke, hide, old ash, moss, cooked fat. The air is thick with it, but not unpleasant. A child curls near the warmth, their fingers drawing patterns in the soot on the floor. An elder sharpens a tool, humming low. Someone stirs a pot. Another listens, then rises to mark something on the wall. Not because they must, but because they feel it is time. Time to remember. Time to leave something behind. That instinct, to leave a trace, is at the heart of culture. And it requires a stable place, a wall that won't wash away, a surface that will hold pigment long enough for someone else to see it. Without shelter, there is no such place, only the fleeting. But with shelter, memory can stick, and in sticking, it becomes history. So much of what we know about Ice Age life comes not from scattered bones or lost tools, but from what people chose to leave on walls. The drawings, the carvings, the arrangements of stones and symbols, these are not accidents. They are messages, not always meant for us, but left nonetheless, as if the act of marking the wall was more important than who would see it. It is a kind of faith, in others, in time, in meaning itself, and in this way, shelter becomes a conversation across generations. Not just warmth for the night, but a voice across centuries. We do not know their words, but we know they wanted to speak, and in that, they are close to us. We build for the same reasons. We mark our spaces with photos, drawings, objects that matter only to us, until they don't, until someone else sees them and wonders. We are not so different. So when you think of Ice Age shelters, do not imagine only circles of bone. Imagine this, a space where stories bloom against the cold. A structure made not just of materials, but of memory and imagination. A refuge that held not just the body, but the growing mind of humanity, and gave it something firm to lean against. Outside, the wind screams, but inside there is warmth, and on the wall, a shadow flickers, painted, imagined, remembered. A bison, a hand, a spiral. The storm cannot reach it, and for a moment, neither can time. There is a line between shelter and exile. It is drawn not with ink or stone, but with the heel of a foot dragging behind a tired body. It is the line families crossed when the snow deepened and the animals vanished, when rivers froze solid and the wind began to speak in voices too ancient to understand. It is a line carved by migration, not of conquest or exploration, but of quiet, necessary escape. And wherever that line was drawn, it had to be redrawn the next day, or the next season, or the next generation. In the Ice Age, the Earth itself was shifting beneath the weight of glaciers. What once was forest could become tundra in 1,000 years, or in 10. The climate did not ask for permission. It pressed forward like a god without language, leaving only its breath behind. In this world, permanence was a myth, and home was not a place, but a practice. How do you carry warmth across a continent? How do you make the idea of shelter portable? Hunter-gatherer groups facing the full hostility of the last glacial maximum did not have cities or stone walls. They had memory, they had hands, they had the knowledge of what wood bent best, what hide could stretch and not tear, how to angle a roof so the snow slid away instead of crushing inward. They built again and again, not because they were restless, but because the land refused to sit still. Across what is now Eastern Europe, Siberia, and the vast treeless steppes of the north, families moved like rivers. They followed reindeer herds, mammoths, and migrating birds, not as predators chasing prey, but as participants in a delicate choreography. To stay too long in one place was to starve, but to move without knowledge was to die in the open. Between these twin threats, a new kind of intelligence emerged, not the brilliance of invention, but the wisdom of preservation. Portable shelters became the fragile answer to a brutal question. What can be carried on your back that still holds back the storm? Archaeological clues whisper their existence. Curved stakes of wood, fragments of sinew ties, burned impressions in old campsites that suggest conical or domed frames. Most were likely made from mammoth tusks and birch poles lashed together with rawhide, then wrapped in hides sewn with bone needles. These homes were not meant to last a century. They were meant to last a journey, and then another. Each one a breath exhaled into the void, temporary and tender, and yet in their impermanence they carried something permanent. They carried the idea that shelter was not a place. It was a promise to keep going, a promise to make a space, however small, where breath could be warm and sleep could be safe. The knowledge of how to build them moved not in books or blueprints, but in calloused fingers and careful observation. How do you teach a child to survive the wind? You show them how to bend a branch until it curves without snapping. You show them how to tie it tight and trust it. This was the first curriculum of migration, not written on hides, but inscribed in motion, in the daily rehearsal of resilience. Each move across the frozen plains was a test. How far could knowledge travel before it frayed? How much could be remembered without being written down? And what was lost if even one elder's hand stilled before passing it on? In this fragile frontier, the skill of building shelter became as critical as knowing the paths of herds or the taste of safe water. Without it, mobility was suicide. With it, mobility became a kind of freedom. For the families who drifted along glacial edges, permanent mammoth-bone huts were impossible luxuries. They could not drag the weight of tusks across hundreds of miles. Instead, they turned to lighter materials, poles cut from scrub willow or birch, sometimes scavenged driftwood from frozen rivers, lashed with sinew and pegged into permafrost. The hides that once formed the walls of a more permanent structure became, instead, skins to be rolled and carried. Stakes and cords became precious, reused again and again. A frame could be assembled in hours. A camp could be struck in less. Shelter became a living thing, folding and unfolding with the rhythm of the hunt. These portable homes were not shoddy improvisations. They were marvels of adaptation. A well-made conical or dome tent could trap heat as effectively as a bone hut if properly sealed. Hides were double-layered, seams stitched with tight overlapping stitches using bone needles. Entryways curved to cut the wind. Fires were dug into shallow pits to keep flames low and steady. Stones were arranged in rings around the base to anchor the walls, preventing the relentless gusts from lifting them into the night sky. Some groups even carried insulated ground mats of moss or woven reeds to line the floors, creating a dry and slightly warmer interior no matter how frozen the tundra. Yet even the best portable shelters were vulnerable. A single tear in a hide, a broken pole, an anchor stone misplaced, and the wind could undo hours of labour in minutes. Families learned to test their homes before nightfall, to pull at seams, tighten ropes, weigh down edges. They learned to patch on the move, to repair under pressure, to improvise with whatever the land offered. The fragile frontier allowed no complacency. Shelter was always provisional, always at risk. But this too was a lesson. Impermanence as a kind of strength. If you cannot make your home immovable, make it adaptable. If you cannot build for eternity, build for the night, and be ready to build again. In this way, knowledge of shelter became a kind of inheritance more portable than any structure. It was carried in stories told around small fires, in demonstrations repeated for children, in the unspoken understanding that the line between warmth and cold was always one camp away from vanishing. Mobility demanded not only skill, but memory. And memory, in a world of ice, became its own form of shelter. Because when materials failed, when the poles snapped in the wind or a hide was left behind during a sudden departure, it was memory that bridged the gap. The memory of shape, of proportion, of how long a skin must soak before it can be stretched taut, and which knots hold in freezing rain. It was memory, too, that reminded them where others had camped before, the shallow depressions in the earth where fires once burned, the scattered stones that once anchored homes. These ghost structures offered not only a place to rest, but clues. How the wind moved here, where the snow drifted deepest, where the sun hit earliest in the morning. Each generation added to this archive not with ink, but through use. Shelters became more than tools. They became records of adaptation, of trial and correction. And every family carried within them a blueprint not of what had been built, but of what had worked. In this, mobility and knowledge were twins. To move well was to remember well. And to forget, even a small detail, could mean ruin. But still there was no giving in to permanence. That was the paradox of the Ice Age frontier. To survive, people needed to move constantly, but they also needed consistency. Not in place, but in method. The very flexibility of these portable homes required strict traditions. Certain shapes returned again and again, the dome, the cone, not because they were artistic preferences, but because they worked. They shed snow, they held heat, they could be built fast and taken down faster. Within that repetition, style began to form. The curve of a roof, the placement of a hearth, even the way hides were stitched. These may have carried regional identities, familial signatures. Across 100 miles, one might have noticed small variations, learned to see the builders in the frame they left behind. And yet, these variations were not indulgences. They were fine-tuned calibrations to place, to local wind patterns, prey migrations, tree species, snowpack. What seems simple to the modern eye, a round tent in the snow, was in truth the visible tip of an iceberg of accumulated expertise. The idea of home had shifted. It was no longer a single structure with fixed walls, but a process, a way of moving through the world with the capacity to pause and create warmth anywhere. Shelter had become internalized. The knowledge was so ingrained that building became second nature, not a decision, but a reflex. This was perhaps the most enduring lesson of the fragile frontier. Survival did not rest in stone or timber, but in the mind. And in this way, the human body itself became a kind of house, carrying not only flesh and breath, but memory, method and meaning, a walking shelter, a thinking tent, capable, wherever it went, of drawing warmth from nothing but what the landscape offered and what the ancestors had quietly passed on. In this landscape of shifting ice and whispering wind, permanence was not the goal, it was the illusion. What mattered was resilience in motion. The family groups of the Upper Paleolithic did not mourn the absence of fixed walls. Their lives were braided into the rhythms of snow and thaw, of departure and return. And within this transience, a different kind of permanence began to grow, one that did not rely on bricks or stone, but on the continuity of care. Each shelter was temporary, yes, but the act of sheltering, the knowledge, the muscle memory, the sharing of task, was enduring. The very act of pitching a tent became a ritual, not in the sense of ceremony, but in the patient repetition of familiar steps that reassured the body. We know how to do this. We have done it before. We can do it again. Children would watch their parents assemble poles in practiced rhythms, learning not just the function of each step, but its deeper meaning. To stretch a hide was to stretch the boundary between exposure and safety. To anchor a wall against the wind was to declare, here, for a time, we live. And when the time came to move again, the dismantling of the shelter was no less significant. It was done with care, not haste, a kind of respectful unmaking, a promise to rebuild when needed. And so the frontier became a thread that wove across generations, a line that was never held in place, but was never truly broken either. Along this path, portable shelters evolved in quiet sophistication. Some were low and wide, designed to resist horizontal winds. Others were taller, banking on the insulating properties of tightly sewn hide. Some had inner linings for added warmth, while others used snow itself as a barrier, packing drifts along the outside walls. Fire pits were carved low to avoid drawing in wind. Entrances were narrowed, often partially covered, to trap heat and prevent snow intrusion. These were not random acts of assembly. They were the architectural fingerprints of lives deeply attuned to their environment. As humans moved farther into northern latitudes, across what is now Siberia, toward the edges of Beringia, and eventually across the land bridge into the Americas, their portable shelters moved with them, evolving subtly along the way. Knowledge travelled not by roads but by relationships. Marriage between groups meant an exchange of building techniques. Encounters between bands led to moments of mutual observation, silent admiration, and sometimes imitation. In this way, shelter became the language of the land, a shared grammar of survival passed not just within families, but across cultures. This quiet diffusion of architectural wisdom created a network far wider than any one clan. Across the icy continent, people were building in similar ways, not because they had agreed, but because they had listened to the wind, to the snow, and to each other. And in listening, they learned that shelter was more than material, it was message. A circle of poles and hides in the white vastness said, "We are still here." It declared belonging without borders, presence without possession. The frontier, though harsh and unknowable, was not merely something to be conquered, it was something to be negotiated with, gently. Each camp raised and taken down was a gesture of respect, a kind of conversation between humans and the elements. The storm might pass or it might linger, but either way, the shelter rose again. By the late Upper Paleolithic, these ephemeral structures had become so finely tuned to their environment that archaeologists today, centuries later, struggle to find them. Unlike stone houses or carved monuments, portable shelters vanish with intention. They leave behind only the faintest impressions: a ring of post holes, a scatter of charcoal, a concentration of bone fragments, a pattern in the soil. These clues whisper rather than shout. They speak of a people who lived lightly, who moved with their world rather than against it, who did not seek to mark time with monuments, but to live within it, flowing. And yet, the fragility of these shelters does not reflect weakness. It reflects intelligence. To live in flux, to thrive in flux, is to accept the truth of the Ice Age, that permanence is not safety and stillness is not peace. The safety lay instead in adaptability, in the fierce continuity of culture passed hand to hand, taught by action, remembered in the fingertips. Even when nothing remained, the knowledge endured. It did not require books. It needed breath and bodies and firelight. It needed only time and the will to continue. In many ways, the shelter itself mirrored the human body, soft at the centre, guarded by flexible skin, always needing warmth, always needing repair. It was a body outside the body. When the wind howled, the shelter shuddered like lungs. When snow fell, it gathered like hair across its flanks. And when the fire flickered low, the entire structure dimmed, a reminder that the centre, the warmth, was what animated it. Without the people inside, the shelter was nothing. With them, it was a living thing. Migration tested every part of the design. When a shelter failed, the lesson was carried forward. When it succeeded, its story was retold. And gradually, over thousands of years, the knowledge of portable shelter became inseparable from human identity itself. It was no longer just a thing to build. It was a way of being. The frontier remained fragile. The ice could crack, the weather could shift without warning, and danger was always close. But so too was the ingenuity of those who walked it. Their shelters, invisible now beneath the snow, were not relics of fear. They were testaments of trust in the materials of the earth, in the memory of their ancestors, and in the endurance of a species that, again and again, made a home wherever they needed one. It was not always the white walls of the storm that posed the greatest danger. Sometimes it was the blizzard inside, the one that raged beneath the ribcage, howled behind the eyes, and pressed in where warmth was supposed to live. What happens when the shelter is built, the fire is lit, and still the cold lingers, not in the air, but in the soul? Even the most carefully constructed dwellings, packed with moss and earth, curved inward to hold warmth, could not always defend against the hunger that gnawed deeper than the cold. There are bones in the ground that tell us this. Scattered sites across Eurasia, those quiet graves beneath Ice Age floors, reveal strange absences, children with brittle bones, their growth stunted, femora hollowed by malnutrition, a feast of marrow drawn not from mammoths, but from one another. This is not mythology or drama, but forensic fact. In desperate places, amid the long silence of winter, survival sometimes trespassed into taboo, and still they built, still they tried, because shelter, even in its failure, gave more than warmth. It gave structure to fear. It gave rhythm to despair. In its darkest hours, the shelter became not a fortress against the elements, but a fragile cathedral for hope. What happens to a mind, locked in darkness, pressed close with others in the stale breath of shared endurance? There is something haunting in the soot that lingers on Ice Age ceilings, not just from cooking fires, but from fingers tracing lines, counting days, scratching spirals into bone and ivory and stone. A need to record, perhaps, a need to remember, even when there is little to remember except the hunger. This is the kind of story that does not comfort, but it teaches, because from this terrible knowledge we glimpse something universal, an unbreakable tether between survival and meaning. A site near Mazirich speaks softly of this. Beneath layers of windblown loess, archaeologists found not only bones and hearths, but fragments of engraved ivory, a curve of mammoth tusk etched with crosshatches in a strange, almost abstract form. What was it meant to preserve? A map of stars? A tally of days, or simply the echo of a mind refusing to be erased. In a world where time could not be measured in hours but only in the long sigh of snow over plains, memory was survival. But memory alone is not enough. You must also believe that there will be something to remember. This is what the storm steals, not just the breath or the body, but the thread of future thought, and that is why the interior matters, not just walls but meaning. What happens when the fire burns low, not in the hearth, but in the chest? What keeps a person alive when the storm has already won outside? Let us linger here, not in comfort, but in clarity. Because to understand how Ice Age families endured, we must understand what they were truly fighting for, not just warmth or meat or safety, but the fragile light within. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this inner struggle. Bones do not speak in words, but their textures and fractures carry stories as clear as any myth. In layers of loess at Dolny Vestonis, Mezhyrich, and across the Dnieper basin, we find evidence of winters where food ran thin. Animal bones cracked and boiled to extract the last drop of grease. Hearths burned small. Faint fires where once there had been roaring flames. And alongside these signs of famine, there are hints of ritual. Tiny beads still buried with the dead, ochre brushed onto a child's bones. Even in hunger, even in loss they painted, they adorned, they marked. Why? Because in the darkest winters, when the blizzard outside had become a blizzard inside, the act of shaping meaning was itself a form of shelter. Shelter for the psyche. Shelter for the thread of self that must be carried forward, or else nothing else matters. Archaeologists call this symbolic behaviour, but it might just as easily be called hope given form. Hope, like warmth, must be built and maintained. It cannot be conjured from nothing. It needs a place to live. Inside those cramped and smoky structures, the air thick with breath and firelight, you can imagine the silence between people. Days when no one spoke because there was nothing left to say. Nights when the wind pressed so hard at the walls that it felt as though the sky itself wanted in. It is here, in this press of body against body, of hunger against will, that the real ordeal emerges. Not the blizzard outside, but the blizzard within. Fear, exhaustion, despair. And yet these were not passive victims. They did something remarkable. They used their shelters as containers for more than bodies. They made them containers for courage. The shared labour of building gave purpose. The flicker of firelight on the hide walls gave the mind a place to settle. Even the familiar smell of moss and fir and wood smoke gave continuity. In a world where nothing stayed, these sensory anchors tethered people to something larger than the storm. This is the deeper function of shelter. It does not merely enclose, it consoles. It tells you there is an inside and an outside. There is a boundary between chaos and order. You belong here. You're not lost in the blizzard. Without that boundary, hunger becomes despair, and despair becomes surrender. With it, even starvation can be endured with dignity, at least long enough to reach another spring, another herd, another chance. And so, within these temporary domes of bone and hide, we glimpse the earliest architecture of resilience. Walls to hold warmth, yes, but also walls to hold hope. Because if the storm outside was deadly, the storm within was lethal. Only together, only inside could they survive both. And so, the shelter became more than a response to weather. It became an act of emotional engineering, a human-made membrane between survival and surrender. When food was scarce, when silence grew long, the structure itself spoke, not in words, but in the way it enclosed a family, wrapped them in shared warmth, shielded them from the crushing vastness outside. And within this fragile boundary, stories began to take root. Somewhere in a wind-lashed corner of Upper Paleolithic Europe, a child might have drawn their finger along the inside of a hide wall, tracing shapes seen in dreams. A parent might have murmured the memory of a hunt, not because the child needed tactics, but because they needed continuity. The blizzard could sweep across the land and erase all scent, all track, but it could not erase a spoken story. In fact, the colder the world became, the more precious these quiet acts of preservation became. Archaeologists at sites like Yana RHS and Kostenki have unearthed delicate pendants carved from reindeer bone, buried in contexts that show no immediate practical purpose. Some are etched with repeating patterns, zigzags, spirals, loops. Others carry wear marks from being handled over and over. These are not tools in the usual sense. They are anchors of identity, charms against the dark, evidence that even when everything was at risk, people held tightly to the unseen. This is what makes the shelters so hauntingly human. They are not merely architectures of defence, they are architectures of remembrance. Within the close confines of curved ribs and stretched hide, people did not just endure the winter, they dreamed beyond it. They made symbols, they whispered to ancestors, they carved futures from memory. And as they did, something else occurred. The shelter became a teacher. When walls were too thin and collapsed beneath snow, lessons were learned. When the entrance admitted too much wind, the next generation narrowed it. When one family perished while another endured, stories carried forward the reasons. In this way, suffering did not merely wound, it instructed. Each mistake layered itself into the design, invisible but present, shaping the dwellings of those yet to be born. And so we find ourselves not just studying bones and hearths, but reading a kind of manual written in survival itself. The soot patterns on ceilings, the way stones are stacked around a fire pit, the curve of a mammoth rib where it meets the ground. These are sentences in a language of endurance, and every time a structure was rebuilt or adapted, that language grew richer. This, then, is the paradox. The more brutal the winter, the more intricate the mind's response, the more desperate the season, the more sacred the shelter became, not just as a place of rest, but as a memory palace, a survival algorithm encoded in ritual, symbol, and structure. The storm outside did not just threaten the body, it provoked the imagination, and the imagination responded quietly with shelter. Not just as a physical defence, but as a place to contain the overwhelming swirl of inner storms. For what the Ice Age demanded was not only strong backs and clever hands, but inner architecture, mental scaffolding strong enough to withstand the weight of uncertainty. And like the homes they built from tusk and timber, this mental resilience was communal. It was built together, shared. When we look at the shelters of the Upper Paleolithic, especially those of Mesurich or Gonzi, we do not see solitary survival. We see small groups huddled close in the darkness. We see shared walls and shared space, shared smoke curling through small openings in the roof. The proximity was not only pragmatic, it was psychological. Loneliness, like cold, could kill, so bodies stayed near. Voices whispered even when there was little to say. These were not just survival units. They were families, interdependent and emotionally tethered. We have no written record of what these people feared most, but we can guess. Not simply the blizzard, but what the blizzard brought. Silence, hunger, and the erasure of everything familiar. In that sense, the storm became a metaphor that transcended weather. It was the embodiment of the unknown. It was death knocking at the door, not dramatically, but patiently, with cold fingers. And so, every time a shelter was repaired, every time a family stayed one more night alive, it was a quiet defiance. A reply. Not yet. Anthropologists have noted that some of the earliest symbolic expressions, lines scratched into ochre, shapes pressed into clay, coincide with periods of climatic instability. When the environment turned most volatile, the human mind turned most symbolic. This suggests something profound, that creativity may have emerged not in ease but in adversity, that the urge to make meaning, to create art, ritual and myth, was itself a coping mechanism, born in shelters pressed tight by snow. Inside those walls, firelight played on faces hollowed by hunger. Children clung to mothers. Tools were sharpened with hands stiff from cold. And still, someone might hum a melody. Still, someone might hang a bone pendant from the central post. Still, someone might tell a story that began long ago, when the world was even colder than this. These acts are not trivial. They are survival strategies as important as any spear point. Because when hope thins, it must be refed, like fire. The structure, the actual bones and hides and ash, might shield the body, but these intangible offerings kept the soul alive. And though we will never hear their voices, the things they left behind, the wear patterns on a tool, the careful alignment of stones, the smooth underside of a pendant rubbed by anxious fingers. These are echoes of inner lives that endured more than just the wind. The blizzard within, then, is not an Ice Age phenomenon, it is a human one. It howls across time asking, when everything is stripped away, what remains? And the answer, again and again, is the same: shelter, fire, and one another. This triad held not just physical lives together, but entire cosmologies. In surviving the visible storm, our ancestors were also fortifying themselves against the invisible one. The storm of meaninglessness, of isolation, of existential cold. The huts they built in the wind were more than structures. They were containers for emotion, spaces that caught and reflected the flicker of the human spirit when it burned low. And in a very literal sense, these shelters became mnemonic chambers, places where memories were made, where grief could be carried without splintering the soul. The psychological burden of famine was not small. In some stratified layers of archaeological sites, like those found at Sunghir or Dolny Vestonitz, we see periods of sudden dietary shifts, the bones of animals not typically hunted, or sudden absences of fauna. These are not just changes in prey, they are signs of desperation. Times when the ecosystem tightened its grip and choices narrowed to survival alone. And yet, during these same periods we also find beads, carvings, burials with care, things done not to prolong life, but to dignify it. These choices point to a central truth, that shelter, at its highest expression, did not merely defend against death, it preserved the meaning of life. It held space for sorrow, for beauty, for the acknowledgement of fragility. Imagine, then, a scene repeated across millennia. A child waking in the night to the scream of wind outside the hut, frightened by its force. They turn to the dim glow of a fire. A parent stirs, pulls them closer. The warmth is thin, but it's enough. The walls creak, but they hold. And in that closeness, fear finds a limit. It does not vanish, but it is held, shared, shaped into something survivable. This capacity, to make emotion inhabitable, to place it within walls and hold it with others, is the hidden architecture of shelter, not stone or tusk, but empathy, not hide, but ritual. These inner forms became as critical as outer ones. Because there is no survival without meaning, and no meaning without memory, and memory needs a place to live. That place, again and again, was the hut, the hearth, the huddled interior carved from ice and fear. So when we think of Ice Age shelter, we must not picture only clever arrangements of mammoth bones or the thermal efficiencies of sod and snow. We must also picture the tremble in a voice that sings to keep despair at bay, the silence between people that is not absence but presence, the small gestures, passing a morsel, adjusting a hide, brushing snow from a sibling's hair. These were the architecture of resilience, and they were built over generations. The storm passed, eventually, not once, but 1,000 times, and every time what carried humanity forward was not merely that they endured, but how they endured, together, in spaces shaped by both necessity and tenderness, shelters not just against the cold, but against the collapse of hope. And in this way, the storm within was met, not defeated, but survived, with story, with warmth, with one another. The storm had passed, but something greater had endured. Not merely the shelter, not merely the warmth of the fire or the hide-wrapped bodies that lay within, but something invisible, something passed from voice to voice, from hand to hand. Beneath the thud of mammoth bones, beneath the quiet brushing of furs, a deeper architecture was taking root. Memory turned into method, and method turned into legacy. How do you build something that outlasts the winds? Among the snow-swept river valleys and Paleolithic steppes, where each generation might vanish into white oblivion, the most enduring structure was not of ivory or sinew, it was instruction. It began in small movements, the way one elder watched the way smoke curled from an entrance flap, then adjusted the tension of the supporting branch, the way another passed a finger along a seam in a hide, taught a child how to stitch with an awl made from reindeer bone, whispering not only the action, but the reason. Too tight, they might murmur. Wind will find it. These were not casual corrections, they were living schematics. The mind became the blueprint, and the mouth became the tool of transmission. But how do we know this? Because even now, in the layered soils of Ukraine and Siberia, archaeologists have unearthed something curious. In settlement sites separated by centuries, even millennia, there exist uncanny similarities in how shelters were constructed. Bone rings of mammoth ribs arranged in near-identical arcs, entrance tunnels oriented to the southeast to capture the low warmth of morning sun. These echoes are not coincidence. They are evidence of something radical, the persistence of knowledge across time, unbound to text or tablet, carried instead in the gestures of the human hand. And yet, how fragile that chain must have been. Consider the stakes. A failed shelter was not merely an inconvenience, it was an obituary. The blizzard made no allowance for faulty roofs. Every imperfection was punished with ice. And so, the stakes carved precision into the bones of tradition. Mistakes were remembered in silence, while successes were remembered in stories, and those stories, tethered to firelight and frost, became the spine of something we might now call architecture, not as an art form but as a condition of survival. The question emerges then, what is the origin of civilization if not this? If not the moment when building became repeatable, when knowledge became transferable, when innovation was no longer a desperate improvisation, but a quiet refinement passed between kin? They were not engineers. They were not architects in the modern sense. They had no plumb lines, no metal nails, no drawn designs on parchment. And yet, their minds held equations written in instinct and experience. How thick must the hide be to stop the wind? How many ribs must form the circle before it stands under snow? How long will the sinew bindings hold before they rot? And more importantly, who will remember when I am gone? This was the unspoken question beneath every shelter built in the shadow of extinction. And it was answered, quietly but profoundly, through the very act of teaching. In the Ice Age, instruction was not institutional, it was embodied. It happened in gesture, in ritual, in repetition. A grandfather's hands would guide a child's, not merely to shape sinew or align a bone, but to give them something they could one day give away in turn. This is what we now recognize as generational knowledge, not only the passing down of technique, but the passing forward of responsibility. The construction of shelter was, in this way, a rehearsal for continuity itself. Archaeologists studying settlement patterns along the Mezin and Dnieper rivers have long been struck by the remarkable regularity of layout in certain mammoth-bone dwellings. Circular bases, domed forms, consistent use of permafrost pits. These are not spontaneous creations. They are evolved structures, each a descendant of previous experiments and accumulated wisdom. They are physical testaments to cultural memory made manifest in architecture. And this memory had to move, because people did not stay in one place, not yet. They were seasonal, migratory, always chasing warmth, game, water, safety. But wherever they went, they carried more than tools, they carried schemas, a pattern for a wall, a solution to snowdrift, an oral recipe for survival, revised slightly in each retelling, but stable in its core truths. Just as stories shift their details but preserve their meaning, so too did these blueprints shift materials but preserve intent. Eventually, over centuries, the shelters themselves began to change in shape and ambition. What had once been temporary structures to endure the cold nights became semi-permanent residences. Settlements began to form clusters. Not just one hut, but many. Grouped, oriented, bound by shared paths and fire pits. With this came new decisions. How far should shelters be from one another? Should walls be shared? Should entrances align, or deliberately turn away? We see in this shift the beginning of a new mode of thinking, one that looks beyond survival and begins to consider society. These were the first urban planners, though they did not know it. And in their shelters we see the foreshadowing of homes, villages, and eventually cities. The fire moved from individual hearth to communal centre, the walls thickened, the interiors became differentiated, space for sleeping, space for working, space for speaking. But the most profound change was not physical, it was temporal. These were no longer shelters built only for the now, but for the later, for children not yet grown, for winters not yet arrived. The act of building stretched forward in time, And this is the moment, quiet, unseen, undocumented, when architecture crossed a threshold. Shelter became heritage. It was no longer just about blocking wind or trapping heat. It was about shaping a place where memory could land and where the future could begin. Each wall, each beam, was a line in a song sung across generations, and someone had to remember how to sing it. Before temples, before palaces, before cities of stone, there were huts of bone, circles of hide, openings carved in the snow, and within them, not merely bodies, but relationships. The architecture of necessity became the architecture of belonging. It taught the first lesson of society. We survive not as individuals, but as a collective memory made flesh. When we examine the archaeological strata of these dwellings, we see evidence of rebuilding, layers of construction over the same footprint year after year, sometimes century after century. There is intention in that, a choice to return, to remain. It means more than geography. It means something held these places in the minds of the people. A kind of rootedness was forming, subtle, nascent, but real. And as shelter became more durable, so too did identity. In this sense, Ice Age homes were not just shelters from weather, but shelters for culture. Their walls enclosed more than warmth. They enclosed customs. The arrangement of bones, the materials chosen, the decorations applied, even the orientation of the doorway, all of these elements became cues of group belonging. To build in a certain way was to speak a dialect of the land, a cultural accent shaped in ivory and hide. What is remarkable is how consistent this became, even as families migrated, as landscapes changed, as animals vanished and rivers froze. The knowledge endured, not through writing but through habit, through ritual, through care. Children grew up watching shelters rise and fall like breathing. They learned with their hands, they learned through failure, and they learned by doing it again and again until the doing itself became identity. In some cases, the structure outlasted the builders. Archaeologists have uncovered bone shelters filled with later layers of symbolic objects, pendants, carved figurines, shell ornaments brought from coasts hundreds of miles away. These were not mere survival shelters anymore. These were homes of ceremony, of meaning, of something deeper than utility. A lineage was being carved not only into the objects but into the very walls that held them. The shelter, once a shield, was becoming a story, and that story had shape, it had pattern, it had memory embedded in it like ash in a hearthstone. This was no longer about staying alive. It was about remembering how you lived, and the structure of that remembrance, passed from grandmother to grandson, from fire builder to wall stitcher, was the first architecture of continuity. It began with function, it ended in meaning, and in between there was form, refined, reiterated, and ultimately inherited. As Ice Age families moved through time, through seasons and migrations, they weren't just adapting to the environment, they were adapting their sense of place, of permanence, of belonging. Shelter, once a reaction to wind and cold, had become a form of ancestral dialogue. We see this most clearly in the gradual shift towards semi-permanence. Shelters no longer assembled in haste but anchored with intent. Mammoth-bone dwellings along the Dnieper show signs of repair and expansion. Entrances were modified, support structures reinforced, floors were compacted with repeated footfall indicating long stays. Fires were built in the same hearth pits for decades. This was no longer a world of brief encampments. These were dwellings of residence. And in that shift from temporary to enduring, something else emerged: planning. To plan a shelter meant to think beyond the day. It meant imagining a storm that hadn't come yet, or a child not yet born. The act of planning, of preparing, of building not just for oneself but for others. This was a fundamental cognitive shift. It demanded foresight, it demanded imagination, and perhaps most importantly it demanded trust. Trust in materials, trust in memory, trust that what had worked before would work again, that the fire would catch, that the walls would hold, that the methods passed down, somehow, invisibly, would be enough. This was the dawning of what we now call architectural knowledge. It is a quiet lineage, unbroken but unnamed, stretching backward through every stone foundation and wooden beam. Before geometry, before blueprints, there were principles, the layering of hides and moss for insulation, the snow-trapping curves of windbreak walls, the sloping of ceilings to redirect smoke. These were not inventions in the grand singular sense. They were revelations, drawn from observation, trial, and deeply patient repetition. And yet, they were not static. The knowledge moved. As families wandered across the tundra, they encountered new materials, different woods, different bones, new fibres. They didn't abandon their knowledge. They adapted it. A rib bone could become a rafter. A driftwood pole could substitute for a femur. The logic of the structure remained, even when the form changed. This adaptability was crucial. It meant the knowledge was portable, flexible, alive. It also meant it could be shared. There is evidence that neighbouring groups, distinct in genetics, language and culture, exchanged building techniques, shared campfires, seasonal gatherings, even chance meetings on the hunt likely became spaces of exchange. One group's solution to melting snow or doorframe collapse became another's innovation. Shelter knowledge rippled outward, weaving its way across icebound plains not as possession, but as collective inheritance. And as that inheritance deepened, so did the bonds between people. A well-built shelter protected the body. A remembered method protected the group. But the passing down of knowledge, the sitting together under skin-roofed stars to show, to learn, to repeat, that protected something even more fragile, the thread of identity. Not the self, but the self in relation. A shelter, not as a possession, but as a shared promise. It is this promise that echoes into the deep future, not in the brittle ribs of mammoths buried beneath loam, but in the architecture of our own minds, because the continuity that began in Ice Age shelters is not just physical, it is psychological, emotional, and symbolic. To shelter is to say, I will protect what I value, I will preserve what I know, I will endure, not alone, but with you. And in that act of building, again and again, storm after storm, culture itself took form. Look closely, and you see the fingerprints of this lineage on every home ever built. The hearth, now nestled in modern kitchens, still anchors meals and memory. The threshold, once stitched with sinew, now swings open on hinges, but still marks the line between danger and safety. Roofs, once made of hide and moss, are now tiled and pitched, but they carry the same intent, to hold back the sky, to offer silence within the howl. This is how shelter, born in desperation, became an emblem of something larger, civilization, before agriculture, before writing, before law. There was the fire and the wall around it. There was the memory of how to build it. And there was the choice to pass that memory on. Each time a child watched her father lash together a frame of branches, each time a grandmother taught how to layer earth to keep the cold out, each time a sibling stood beside a sibling to hold the bones steady against the wind, a civilization was rehearsing its future, not in temples, not in conquest, but in continuity. Because shelter isn't merely about staying alive. It is about defining what life is worth protecting. It is about choosing to shape the world around you so that it reflects the world within. The physical form, walls, beams, roof, becomes a vocabulary. And what is spoken, through structure, is a story of care, of intention, of memory, and ultimately of hope. For even in the deepest cold, even in the longest winter, the act of building is an act of belief. Belief that the storm will pass, that the walls will hold, that others will come after you, and that they will know what you knew, because you left it for them, not in stone tablets, but in the shape of a home, the warmth of a fire, the method of assembly remembered by heart. The Ice Age did not merely test humanity, it revealed what was most human, and as the wind howled across the steppe, the families who endured did more than survive. They built, and in building they told each other, we are not just bodies hiding from the cold, we are memory, made durable. We are meaning, given form. We are the architects of continuity. And in every shelter that still rises against the elements, their story remains, quiet, resilient, and alive. They never thought it would last forever. The walls of Tuscan hide, the compacted earth holding the memory of fires long gone cold, the echo of stories whispered around hearths that had no stone but glowed with the same need to hold something against the dark. And yet, in ways quiet and unseen, it did last. You are in it now. Perhaps you're in a house with layered insulation and glass windows. Perhaps you are curled in a high-rise warmed by electricity or a hut roofed with palm leaves, but you are unmistakably in a shelter. And this shelter, whether humble or vast, is not merely built upon land. It is built upon memory, for every home is a descendant of that first defiance against the snow. But what is a house if not a refined echo of the first circle drawn against the wind? Modern architecture may speak in steel and concrete, but its grammar was born in mammoth-bone and stitched hide. Even the shape of things, the central hearth, the protective roof, the threshold, carries within it the blueprint drafted by hands calloused from scraping frozen sinew. The hallways of apartment buildings, the winding paths of suburban neighbourhoods, even the way we speak of warmth and cold, inside and out, echo the elemental logic first written with frostbitten fingers in permafrost soil. What is central heating but the modern evolution of the sacred fire? What is a bedroom but a womb carved in shelter from a world too vast to face all at once? But we must ask, how did the storm become the architect of our inner world? Is it possible that survival was only the beginning, that in the space between threat and safety something else was born? Imagine for a moment the moment when the first child laughed inside a finished shelter, not merely alive, but unafraid. That moment contains the seed of civilization, because to be safe is to have room for language, room for lullabies, room for thought. Before temples, before palaces, before cities with walls, there was this, a family inside a dome of mammoth ribs, eating, singing, enduring. The shelter was not simply a shield, it was a stage for being human, and that human essence, that thread, was never severed. It twisted and stretched, followed migrations, reinvented itself in mud brick and timber, in yurts and caves, in ice huts and reed-thatched roofs. The form changed, but the intent remained. Hold the storm at bay long enough to dream. Our ancestors did not merely survive the Ice Age, they survived themselves, their own fear, their own doubt, and in doing so, they built more than homes, they built continuity, and continuity is not measured in materials but in meaning. What happens when meaning finds walls to echo in? What happens when memory gets a roof? What happens when time itself, that coldest of all forces, is slowed by a circle drawn in warmth? What happens is this, a return not just from the storm but to something older than it. Because the storm was always temporary, but the need to belong, that was permanent. Belonging is not a luxury, it is a structure. It begins not with language or even love, but with shelter. To stand behind a wall you helped create is to say, here, I matter. And so shelter, in the deepest sense, was not merely protection from death. It was the foundation for identity. The first boundary between the self and the world. The hearth as nucleus, the walls as skin, the roof as sky. And today, when we shut a door behind us, we're repeating a ritual older than written language. There is a small but ancient satisfaction in hearing the click of a lock, in setting a blanket just so, in arranging furniture into forms that cradle our routines. These are not just habits, they are echoes. Our modern rooms carry shadows of Ice Age memory. The den is the memory of the communal hearth. The hallway, a softened version of the passageways between connected huts. The attic, perhaps, is a ghost of the smoke hole. Once necessary to breathe, now simply a place for forgotten things. Even the materials we choose whisper to us. Wood remembers forest, stone remembers the earth. Glass, though modern, pretends to be water, and though most of us no longer sleep under hides, the idea of layering, of creating warmth by placing the world in order, so persists. We hang curtains like we once hung hides. We insulate walls like we once stuffed moss between ribs. Our structures may rise taller, but their emotional blueprints remain grounded in survival, and survival over time became something more. It became story. Consider the fairy tale cottage, a home in the woods, standing against darkness, promising safety with a chimney's curl of smoke, or the idiom safe as houses, or the expression a roof over your head. These are not modern inventions, they are cultural fossils. Language itself remembers the storm. In myth and metaphor, in idiom and intuition, shelter remains a sacred act. But there is also something deeper, something unspoken. When a child builds a pillow fort, there is joy, yes, but also a primal satisfaction. To take fabric and tension, and turn it into a world apart is to participate in the same instinct that once raised circles of bone against blizzards. The child is not just playing. They are remembering, not in words, but in gesture. In every generation, the storm is reborn in dreams, and so is the act of sheltering from it. Because even now, when snow falls against double-glazed windows and thermostats hum invisibly, the mind knows the storm still exists. Somewhere it waits, and somewhere inside us, so does the knowledge that we can outlast it, not by strength alone, but by the quiet intelligence of walls and warmth. This is what makes shelter more than structure. It is resistance shaped into rhythm, survival woven into story. And it is here, in this quiet return from the storm, that we understand the deeper revelation. Our ancestors did not only escape death, they birthed continuity. Each shelter was not only a haven, but a message. Not only a shield, but a shape for life. Through the generations, the knowledge of shelter became scaffolded into memory. There were no blueprints, no scrolls. But there was something stronger, the architecture of the body. A child learned to pull hide tight by watching their mother stretch sinew between ribs. A boy watched his father pile stones to anchor the wind. They didn't ask why the entrance curved, or why the floor sloped slightly down. They built because that's how it was built. And this tactile inheritance, passed skin to skin, carried memory longer than words ever could. This is the invisible thread of architecture. Long before monuments or temples, the first built form was a memory of warmth, reenacted with each new season. Across continents, forms converged, because the problem was the same, and so was the response. Low ceilings to trap heat, domed shapes to resist wind, entrances aligned away from prevailing storms. These were not theories, they were answers carved from cold, and as mobility gave way to settlement, the structures thickened. What began as emergency became permanence. The temporary hut became the seasonal house, then the year-round home. Clay was added, then brick, then stone. But underneath, the purpose was unchanged. Shelter was never just the pause between journeys, it was the beginning of place. The moment when a people said, "Here, now." The earliest villages were not just clusters of homes, they were affirmations of survival turned into culture. A fire ring became a gathering place. A cluster of dwellings became a kin group. Eventually a wall around them became a city. And all of it, every layer of brick, every carved beam, carries an ancestral echo. Shelter as defiance. Shelter as declaration. Shelter as the seed from which civilization grows. Even our most complex buildings, cathedrals, parliaments, libraries, carry the same DNA. They are enclosures for warmth, for thought, for togetherness. Our homes shelter families. Our schools shelter learning. Our hospitals shelter healing. And though the materials are tempered steel and electric glass, the purpose is timeless, to keep out the storm and hold in the life. And so when we speak of architecture, we are not only speaking of design, we are speaking of memory, of protection, of the oldest human promise, you will not face the cold alone. This was the first unspoken contract, not just between builder and shelter, but between human and human. A wall was more than defense, it was commitment. When one generation taught the next how to build, they were doing more than passing on technique. They were passing on belonging, and over time these lessons, given in gestures and calloused hands, grew into culture itself. Every stone placed against the wind, every pelt tied tight, was a vote for continuity. Against the chaos of the ice, people made order. In the howl of the storm, they answered with structure. And this dialogue between elements and ideas forged a foundation deeper than soil. It forged civilization. To shelter someone is to affirm their worth. And in the Ice Age, when resources were scarce, and every survival counted, this was no small thing. The walls we built were the first declarations of empathy. You build shelter not only for yourself, but for those you love, for the children not yet born, for the old who cannot gather wood, but who once taught you to light the fire. Shelter becomes inheritance, not of wealth, but of care. And so, even as the centuries passed and the storms grew quieter, the instinct endured. To take raw material and make safety, to look at a branch, or a bone, or a stone, and imagine warmth. This was our earliest creativity, sparked not by luxury, but by necessity. It is no surprise that the same hands that built the first shelters would later paint the first walls. Art, too, was born from shelter. Culture required stillness, and stillness required protection. This is the revelation we carry now. The home is not the opposite of adventure. It is its reward. After the hunt, after the journey, after the winter, there is a place to return to, and the shape of that place tells us who we are. In its quiet, in its layers, in its smoke-darkened beams and child-worn floors, it whispers the continuity of life. It is the one structure that always points both forward and back. We may not think of our homes this way, not always. We decorate, remodel, build upward, build outward. But beneath the drywall and the light switches, the legacy remains. You're surrounded by the thinking of ancestors who learned to read the wind, who layered moss between hides, who aligned doorways to catch sun in winter. Your home is not modern. It is timeless. One more ring in the great circle of survival. So when you shut your door against the night, remember this. You're not alone in your architecture. The shape of your living is older than history. You dwell in the long shadow of huts built from death and love and vision. The shelter holds, and in its walls the storm finally quiets. But the quiet is not emptiness. It is the sacred hush of endurance, the sound that follows survival. It is the silence of lives continued, of small comforts hard won, of a humanity that did not surrender to the wind. In this stillness we find the deepest truth of all, that shelter was never only about weather, it was about memory. Each home, from mammoth-bone circle to suburban foundation, is a vessel that holds time. The soot from fires long cold still lingers in cave ceilings. The wear of countless footsteps smooths stones into stories. Even today, the scratches of children on floorboards, the scent of meals rising in kitchens, the soft rhythm of rain on rooftops. These are echoes of the very first encampments huddled against the ice. The storm taught us many things. It taught us to plan, to build, to protect. But perhaps more than anything, it taught us to gather. A shelter is not just walls and heat. It is the act of choosing to stay, to remain close. In the worst hours of the Ice Age, the safest place was not just the warmest, it was the one with others inside it. This, then, is the final legacy: belonging. Shelter became culture because it gathered us close enough to imagine together, to speak, to sing, to carve, to comfort. And when we step into a home today, we cross that same invisible threshold, the boundary between chaos and calm, between exposure and embrace. We are returned from the storm not only physically, but emotionally. A home is the restoration of identity. It says here you are safe to be yourself, and here you are part of something longer than yourself. Our Ice Age ancestors did not think of themselves as architects, but they were. They built not only structures, but systems of knowledge, rituals of preservation, and ways of living that shaped all that followed. Civilization began in the space between the fire and the hide wall. The world was born not from the hunt, but from the hearth. So as this journey ends, this slow walk across frozen plains and bone circles and painted walls, the invitation is simple: look around you. Feel the roof over your head, the warmth on your skin, the softness of the place you sleep. These are not luxuries, they are inheritances. They are the outcome of a long and ancient defiance, a promise whispered in mammoth-bone and firelight: we will endure, and we have. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for walking this long road through the ice, tracing the silent blueprints of shelter from mammoth bones to memory foam. If this story helped you feel a deeper connection to the homes you inhabit, stirred wonder at the resilience of your ancestors, or sparked a new question about the roots beneath your feet, thank you for being here, for making space in your mind for these echoes of survival. Perhaps there was a moment, a glint of firelight in a bone hut, or a child painting shadows onto a cave wall, that stayed with you, long after the blizzard passed. Whether it was the hush of hides layered against the wind, the curve of a mammoth rib turned roof beam, or the quiet courage of a family waiting out the storm, these fragments are what connect us, not just to the past, but to one another. If any of these images linger with you, feel free to share your reflection in the comments, not as an answer, but as a quiet offering to the circle we're building here. If you found meaning in this journey, consider subscribing, liking, or sharing, and follow us into the next story, where we'll uncover the whispers of another forgotten threshold. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,